Section 30 of the Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 22, Part 1. Antecedent to the events mentioned in the last chapter, one of considerable importance to Terence Adair occurred. He had to forego a court-martial for the loss of the Flash. She had been run on shore. Of that there was no doubt. But when there, he had fought her with the greatest gallantry, and had done his utmost to get her off. The result of the investigation was that, having been admonished for the loss of his ship, his sword was returned to him. "Really, my dear Adair, I don't think you need break your heart about the matter," said Jack to him when he returned on board the Tornado, which he had joined as a volunteer. Tom and Desmond were already on board her. "Depend upon it, it won't stand in the way of your getting another ship or promotion. I hear that the Admiral highly approves of your conduct, and that he has stated he will give you solid proof of his opinion as soon as a vacancy occurs." These remarks raised poor Terence's spirits, and he wrote a very hopeful letter to Admiral Triton, which he hoped might be shown to Lucy rather than the one he had penned some time previously. Still some weeks went by, and Adair remained without a ship. He at length got a cheery reply from his old friend in answer to his letter, urging him to keep up his courage, and prophesying that all would turn out well at last. "There is a young lady by my side who fully agrees with me, and who is as ready as I am to admire the gallant way in which you fought your ship, and to appreciate your merits, whether the Admiralty do so or not. I'm the last man to advise a promising young officer to leave the service, but should you be compelled to come on shore and turn your sword into a reaping hook, I have made such arrangements as will enable you to do so without having to depend solely upon your pittance of half pay," wrote the Admiral. "What can the kind old man mean?" asked Terence, when he showed the letter to Jack. Jack smiled. Perhaps he had heard something about the matter. "It is evident that he has your interest at heart," he answered, "and intends to give you substantial proof of his regard. However, my opinion is that you will not be laid on the shelf, and that if you remain out here the Admiral will give you the first vacancy that occurs." Jack was right. A few days afterwards, on the return of the Tornado to the fleet, the Admiral sent for Adair, and complimenting him on the gallant way in which he had fought the Flash, informed him that he was appointed to the Gleam, the commander of which had just been invalided home. Adair's heart bounded as if a load had been taken off it. Without loss of time he went on board his new command. His natural wish was now to do something by which he might gain credit. "Let me advise you, my dear fellow," said Murray, who paid him a visit on board, "not to trouble yourself about that, but just go straight forward and do your duty, and you'll gain all the credit you can desire in doing that." Terence followed his friend's advice, and was warmly complimented by the Admiral for his zeal and activity in carrying out the orders he had received, although he had done nothing to fill a page in history. The Tornado was lying in the Golden Horn, having made her last trip to the Crimea, when a Caïque came up alongside. An old gentleman in somewhat quaint costume seated in the stern. Green, who happened to be near the gangway, on looking down recognized his old German friend, Herr Groben. "Glad to see you," he exclaimed, as he ran down to help him up the accommodation ladder. "Ah, my friend Green, I'm delighted to see you," answered Herr Groben, shaking his hand warmly with both of his. "I come on a very delicate and important matter, and you can help me greatly." "Very glad to help you do anything you wish," answered Green, "provided it doesn't amount to treason or petty larceny." "Ah, no, my friend, this is no treason," answered the old tutor, looking over his shoulder as if he expected to see a Russian spy there. "It relates entirely to another sort of affair. You know that Mr. Higson, the first lieutenant of this ship, fell in love with the eldest sister of my pupils. And to confess to you the truth, the young lady fell in love with him, and she has been expecting, now that the dreadful war is over, that he would go back and claim her hand. So I suppose he intends doing, when the ship is paid off, but till then he is not his own master, and he could not get away however much he might wish it," answered Green. Mademoiselle Ivanovna does not understand that sort of thing, and began so to pine and fret that she became very ill indeed. In seeing her state, I volunteered to come to Constantinople, where I heard your ship was likely to be found, to bear a message to Lieutenant Hickson, and I have been greatly anxious till I got on board lest the ship should have sailed away. Where is your first lieutenant, that I may deliver myself forth of my message?" "For a wonder he has gone on shore," answered Green, "but he will be off again soon, and in the meantime we will take good care of you. So come down at once into the gun-room, and we shall have luncheon on the table immediately." Herr Groben was warmly received by the officers when they heard who he was, and soon had out of him the whole history of the loves of Lieutenant Hickson and the fair Ivanovna. Lieutenant Mildway expressed his intention of writing it in verse. The doctor proposed their healths during luncheon, in conjunction with that of the Queen of England and the Emperor of Russia, now the best friends in the world. After luncheon, as Hickson did not appear, Herr Groben expressed a wish to go round the ship, and Green at once offered to conduct him. As he was going round the lower deck, he popped his head into the midshipman's berth, when whom should he see seated directly before him but Tom Rogers? The recognition was mutual. Tom started up. "Oh, Herr Groben, I am delighted to see you," he exclaimed. "Do tell me, how is Miss Feodorovna? Have you just come from there?" "Not very long ago," answered Herr Groben, "and I can tell you that they have not forgotten you, and she told me if I saw you to give her very kind remembrances." "Is that all?" asked Tom. "Of course," exclaimed Paddy Desmond, who was seated in the berth. "What more could you expect from a young lady?" "Then doesn't she care about me?" cried Tom, forgetting that several of his messmates were within hearing, and that they were not likely to forget his question. "As to that I must be discreet," answered the old tutor, laughing. "If you ever come back to Russia in peaceable guise, not in one of your ships with big guns to batter down our forts, you may depend upon it, Colonel Paskowitch and his family will be very happy to see you." The conversation was cut short by Green, who had gone away, returning to conduct Herr Groben into the gun-room. Soon after he was seated there, Hickson returned on board, little expecting whom he was to find. Though he had never been known to exhibit the slightest signs of nervousness, he looked excessively agitated on seeing the old tutor, who, after telling him that he had lately come from the family of Colonel Paskowitch, requested a private interview. The old German had evidently something of importance to communicate beyond what he had told Green. Hickson's agitation, as he proceeded, increased. He, however, at length came to a decision, and Herr Groben returned on shore, saying that he should expect to see him the next day. When Jack, who had gone on board the Gleam to see Adair, just on the point of sailing for England, returned to his own ship, Hickson begged to have a few minutes' talk with him. Jack, of course, granted it, and begging him to come into his cabin, sat down to listen to what he had to say. "We have been shipmates a good many years, Commander Rogers, and I am going to ask a favor of you," he began. "You know how I fell in love with a young lady in Russia, and she has fallen desperately ill in love with me, it seems. I don't say it as a boast, and cannot account for it. And what is more, her mother sends me word that she is dying for fear I should go away and forget her, or at all events not come back again. Now, I have no thoughts of doing anything of the sort, though the young lady may believe what I will write her. I would rather give her practical evidence of my affection by paying her a visit at once. I could be there and back in a week or 10 days, and if you could manage to give me leave for that period, I would run over and see them. And I trust that neither the service nor the ship will suffer from my absence." Jack reflected on the request made to him, and considering that Hickson merited all the favor he could grant at his hands, and that the duty of the ship could be carried on in the meantime, gave him the leave he asked. Hickson expressed himself very thankful, and set about making arrangements for his intended journey. Scarcely had Hickson left the cabin when Tom entered and begged to have a few minutes' conversation with his brother. "What is it?" asked Jack. Tom went into the whole story of the kind treatment he had received from the family of Colonel Paskowitch. "And you must know," he continued, "that I fell in love with Miss Feodorovna, and promised to go back and marry her as soon as the war was over." "Really, Tom, I hope with a proviso that you should obtain the permission of Sir John," remarked Jack. "I don't know about provisionally," answered Tom. "I promised to go back and marry her as soon as peace was settled, and as you wouldn't wish me to break my promise, I hope you will give me permission to do so at once." Jack burst into a loud fit of laughter. "I'll tell you what, Tom, I'm much more likely to marry you to the gunner's daughter," he answered. "That is very cruel treatment," exclaimed Tom. "You'll drive me to quit the service, and expatriate myself forever." Jack only laughed louder. "Do you mean to say that you are going to deprive the country of your valuable services, bid farewell to your father and mother and sisters, or perhaps take service in the Russian Navy, should they ever launch any fresh ships, and turn your sword against your countrymen, simply because I refused to let you go and make a fool of yourself by marrying this little Russian girl? Though my belief is, even should I let you, as soon as her father finds out that you haven't a sixpence to bless yourself with, he'll send you about your business with a flea in your ear. Come, Tom, think the matter over. You used to have some brains in your head, and I hope you have not left them all behind you in the Sea of Azov." Still, Tom was obstinate. He really had a midshipman-like amount of attachment for Feodorovna, but though it was very disinterested and sincere and romantic, it was not the less foolish. Nothing Jack could say would induce him to promise to give up all thoughts of her, and to write a kind note pointing out the impossibility of their marrying, and bidding her farewell. "She mayn't see the impossibility of it," answered Tom. "Her father is the owner of thousands of acres and country houses and serfs, and she told me that all he wanted was to get gentlemanly, intelligent sons-in-law, who could live in his houses and superintend the cultivation of his estates." "Well, well," said Jack, "that doesn't sound so badly, but still, you have no right at your age to go and marry without our father's and mother's sanction, and until you have got it, I'll be no party to your giving up the service and settling down for life in an out-of-the-way corner of Russia. With regard to Hickson, the case is very different. He is twice your age, has very little prospect of promotion, and no friends that I know of to give up. Besides which, I'm pretty certain that nothing would induce him to take service in the Russian Navy, with the chance of being employed against England." "I don't see that our cases are so very different," answered Tom, "and you may put me in irons, and do what you like, but I'll not promise to give up Feodorovna, nor write the cruel letter you propose, to bid her farewell. There, you've got my answer, and I've in no way infringed the Articles of War by saying that, though you are my commander." "I'm not quite certain that you have not, by the tone in which you speak," answered Jack. "However, I'm very sorry for it, Tom, and warn you that, as you are obstinate, I must take measures accordingly." What those measures were, Jack did not tell his brother. Having dismissed him, he sent for Dick Needham, and desired him to keep a watchful eye on the youngster, lest he might take French leave and quit the ship. "Aye, aye, sir," answered Dick, "though they're not a bad sort of people in the main. I shouldn't like Mr. Tom to turn into a Russian. It won't be my fault if he gets leg bail." Satisfied on this point, Jack, ordering his gig, pulled on board the Gleam, which ship was to sail the next day for England. The Giaour had gone home some time before, and Murray hoped to pay her off and to be allowed to remain on shore with his beloved Stella. Jack explained his anxieties about Tom to Adair, who at once agreed to take him home, and not to lose sight of him till he had handed him over either to Admiral Triton or Sir John and Lady Rogers. "Take him in the first instance to the Admiral," said Jack. "He will consider his opinion as less biased than that of our father and mother, and be more likely to yield submission to it." On his return to the Tornado, Jack ordered Tom's marine to pack up his chest and have it lowered into his gig alongside. He then summoned Tom, and allowing him to wish his messmates good-bye, told him to follow his chest. Tom looked, as he felt, very unhappy. Dicky Duff and Billy Blueblazes especially thought him a hardly used individual, though his older messmates were more inclined to laugh than to sympathize with him. Adair received him on board in a very kind way, and Desmond acted the part of a true friend by listening to all he had to say, though he avoided giving him any encouragement. And when Tom declared his intention of making his escape in the first caïque which came alongside, he warned him that he could not possibly succeed. Next morning the Gleam steamed away down the Bosphorus. Tom had not been many hours at sea before he recovered his spirits, and was able to admire the beautiful scenery amid which the ship was steering her course. Having now settled this matter to his satisfaction, Jack turned his attention to the affair of his first lieutenant. Higson's interview with the old tutor had confirmed him in his resolution to abandon the service and marry Ivanowna, and Jack, though sorry to lose him, promised to do his best to forward his views. Jack gave him leave of absence, and Higson was engaged in packing up to accompany Herr Groben in a steamer which was to start the next day for the Crimea, when the commander of the Tornado was sent for on board the flagship. Greatly to his satisfaction, Jack found that he had to return to Balaclava on an affair relating to the evacuation of the place, and afterwards to visit other places to the eastward which had been captured by the Allied squadrons and restored to the Russians. "This is a most fortunate circumstance for you, Higson," he said, when he returned on board. "You will have an opportunity of visiting your friends, and if you take my advice, you will go home in the ship, and, as I hope, obtain your promotion." Higson, thanking Jack, promised to be guided by circumstances. The Tornado had got her steam up when the mail from England was signalled, and Jack waited for its arrival. He received several letters, one from his sister Mary, replete, as was usually the case in her letters, with scraps of news. The most important, as far as he himself was concerned, was that Julia Giffard was somewhat out of health, and that her father had taken her to Malta, where they intended to pass the winter. Sir John and Lady Rogers were as adverse as ever to Lucy's marriage with Adair, not from any objection to him, except on account of his want of means, and they were annoyed at the encouragement Admiral Triton and Miss Deborah appeared to have afforded the young people. The Admiral had actually written to Sir John on the subject, but neither he nor Lady Rogers could understand his meaning, except that he thought him unwise in objecting to a fine promising young officer, who was certain, if he remained in the service, to become an admiral some day. "Poor Lucy is sadly perplexed about it," said Mary. "She has given her heart to Adair, and is certainly not a person likely to bestow it on any one else, so that her fate will be a hard one if she is not allowed to marry." Sidney had returned home very much improved by his Crimean campaign, having dropped all his guardsman's airs, and become, Mary observed, very like Jack himself. Jack would have been more deeply concerned about Julia had he not received a letter from her, assuring him that the voyage had done her a great deal of good, and that she was looking forward to the happiness of seeing him shortly on his arrival at Malta. Murray had reached England, but much to his disappointment, the Giaour had not been paid off, and he had been directed to hold himself in readiness to sail immediately. He spoke of the Admiral as very much broken, while Mrs. Deborah was also ailing. He could not sufficiently express his gratitude for the kindness with which the old people had treated Stella and his 2 children. She was still residing with them at Southsea. They insisted on their remaining there till his return, to which he had consented, as he hoped not to be long absent from home. "I shall then," he said, "not seek for employment, and as I have some hopes of my promotion, I may become an admiral some day. I had expected to have been back at Balderkine to have been able to receive you and Mrs. Jack Rogers on your wedding tour. Perhaps even now I may be home in time, and at all events, my dear Jack, I look forward to the pleasure of seeing you and Terence Adair there as one of the greatest in this sublunary world." Jack had read his letters when Higson entered the cabin with an official-looking dispatch in his hand. "Congratulate me," he exclaimed. "I received what I little expected, my promotion, and as there is small chance of my being employed, I think you will agree that I should be wise in taking advantage of the good fortune offered me." "I congratulate you heartily," said Jack, "and I won't say a word to dissuade you." Higson, after considerable trouble, succeeded in obtaining a commander's full-dress uniform, with which he expressed himself highly delighted. He had just time to get on board when the Tornado steamed away for Balaclava, with the worthy tutor, to whom Jack had offered a passage on board. The duties with which he had been charged at Balaclava having been performed, Jack continued his course to the eastward, and the Tornado soon arrived off the fort, which he had had so gallant a contest. Giles Green having undertaken to carry the tornado up the river, as far as the depth of water would allow, she entered its mouth, keeping the lead going, and proceeded on at half speed till she came off Colonel Paskowich's house. Her approach had been perceived. Gay flags, that of England being the highest, were hoisted on the flagstaff near the house, and numerous persons were seen collected at the landing-place. Jack agreed to accompany Hickson, who of course had put on his commander's uniform, on shore. The two other boats followed with most of the officers, all in full dress. The colonel was the first person to greet them. He welcomed them cordially, and invited the whole party up to the house, where the ladies sat ready to receive them. The eyes of the fair Ivanowna beamed with pleasure as they rested on the gallant commander, though she cast them down modestly as he approached to take her hand, which he lifted gallantly to his lips. The eyes of poor little Feodorovna wandered in vain among the group of officers in the background in search of Tom, and her countenance fell on discovering that he was not among them. Unable to restrain her anxiety, she asked Herr Groben, who was compelled to inform her of the truth, on hearing which she burst into tears. "How very, very cruel to send him away!" she exclaimed. "I don't see why my sister's lover should have been allowed to come, and mine been sent off to England." Herr Groben tried to explain that the one was a commander, and the other only a midshipman, and that while one might be allowed to act as he thought fit, the other was still under the direction of his parents. Nothing, however, would comfort her. It had, however, the effect of making her look very interesting, and just at that moment any one of the officers would have been perfectly ready to take Tom's place, especially Dicky Duff and Billy Blueblazes. Indeed, they both determined to make her an offer in the course of the evening, and to toss up which should first do so. Perhaps the attention she received somewhat consoled her, for she soon dried her tears, and to all appearance became perfectly happy. After a magnificent banquet, when the table literally groaned with viands of all descriptions, a dance was got up, several young ladies arriving from various houses in the neighborhood, while for a couple of hours after it had begun, others, to whom notice of the coming of the English ship had been sent, arrived from greater distances. As a natural consequence, all the unmarried and unengaged officers lost their hearts to Russian young ladies, and it was said that Feodorovna received certainly 2, if not 3 offers before the evening was over. Jack, when he found the state of affairs, began to consider whether he had not made a mistake in coming to the place. End of section 30. Section 31 of The Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 22, Part 2. Not till morning dawn did they return on board. Honest Hickson was, of course, the hero of the evening, and it was very evident from the attention the colonel paid him that he was well pleased with his intended son-in-law. After breakfast the next morning, Hickson begged Jack to wait till his wedding, which he told him had been fixed for the next day. "Rather sharp work," observed Jack. "Why, the fact is," answered Hickson, "Madame Paskowitch is anxious to give the marriage éclat by having the advantage of your presence and that of my late shipmates, and as the young lady did not object, of course I was delighted, and I hope you will be able to stay." Jack, of course, agreed, and the news, soon spreading round the ship, afforded infinite satisfaction. It would take more space than can be allowed to describe the magnificence of the fête. As many of the officers as could be spared were invited on shore, while an abundance of good viands were sent off to those who had to remain on board to take care of the ship. The whole neighborhood were assembled in their gayest costumes. The upper classes were entertained either in the house or in a large marquee erected on the lawn, and tables were spread in the neighboring field for the peasantry and seamen, who, though they could not exchange many ideas, became nevertheless on excellent terms. Everyone, indeed, seemed to forget that a few months before their respective nations had been engaged in a fierce and bloody struggle. The marriage ceremony was performed in a neighboring church. Though Jack, who acted as Higson's best man did not admire the style of the service, and the pictures of saints and bowings and singing, he came to the conclusion that his friend was as firmly spliced as he would have been in a quiet English country church, and that, after all, as he remarked to him, was the chief point to be considered. The officers and crew of the Tornado made all the preparations in their power to do honor to their former first lieutenant's marriage. The ship was decked with flags, and the boat's crews who had attended the wedding requested the honor of escorting the young couple round the ship. A barge having been got ready for the reception, accordingly, Higson, leading his bride down to the water, embarked, and was rowed 3 times round the ship. While the crew manned yards, the band played Haste to the Wedding, and the guns fired a salute. Jack and his officers also had arranged to give a ball on board, and invitations had been sent out through Madame Pascowitch to all her acquaintances. The ship for the purpose had been housed in, and by an extensive use of bunting, the deck had been converted into a perfect ballroom, while a handsome supper was laid out in Jack's cabin and the gunroom. The ship's boats, aided by a few from the shore, were employed in bringing off the guests, and as they danced away merrily to the music of the ship's band, few recollected that a few months before the big guns on that deck had been busily engaged in firing on their countrymen. It was one proof of many how slight an interest the nation at large had felt in the war, which they had looked upon as an imperial affair, with which they themselves had nothing to do beyond sending, as in duty bound, their quota of friends and relatives to be slaughtered. Altogether the ball was pronounced a success, and the officers and their guests parted mutually satisfied with each other. Theodoralna, who suspected that Jack had been the cause of Tom's being spirited away, could not help at first exhibiting her displeasure, but by degrees he calmed her anger, assuring her that Tom would have proved a very unsatisfactory husband, as he was much too young for her, and would in a few months have gotten heartily sick of an idle life on shore, and either taken to drinking or run away, and that she would do much more wisely to choose an older partner for life, on which he naively inquired whether his second lieutenant was disengaged. Jack assured her that he was wedded to the Muses, and that he doubted much whether, even for her sake, he would be induced to break off his engagement, but that he would ask him. On Mildmay's begging to be excused, she begged Jack to select one of the officers, but he told her that, notwithstanding his wish to oblige her, such not being the duty of a captain of a man of war, he must decline interfering in the matter. The result was that, having bade Higson and his bride farewell, and wished them every happiness, Jack ordered the fires to be got up, and steamed away down the river. Greatly to his satisfaction, on his return to Constantinople, he was ordered off to Malta, where he found Julia Giffard and her father. Jack thought Julia looked as blooming as ever. She acknowledged that the voyage had done her so much good that she thought she should be ready to go back again, should he be ordered to England. "Then your father will, I hope, take a passage on board my ship?" said Jack. "The Admiral will not now object to your doing so, but had I the happiness of calling you my wife, it would be against the rules of the service, and I should very likely be compelled to let you come home by some other vessel." Julia raised no objection to this proposal, and the colonel very kindly said he wished to do whatever his daughter liked. Jack, therefore, waited with some anxiety to hear the Admiral's decision as to his future proceedings. To assist in deciding the point, he directed the engineer to make a report as to the state of the engines, while the carpenter sent one in respecting the condition of the ship. Both were of opinion that, though her safety would not be endangered by the voyage home, she was in a condition to require such a thorough repair as could only be obtained in England. "In fact, Commander Rogers, you have no objection to go home and pay off your ship, I presume?" observed the Admiral. "You certainly have not had much opportunity of allowing the weeds to grow on your keel since she was commissioned, and I shall therefore send you home with dispatches, when the Admiralty will decide whether or not to pay the ship off." Jack, highly pleased, came back with the news to Julia, who the next day took possession of the cabin Jack had fitted up for her accommodation. "This is indeed perfect," she exclaimed, as she admired the neat chintz curtains and furniture, vases and flowers and pictures which adorned the bulkheads. I'd no idea that a cabin could be made so nice and pretty." The Colonel was equally well pleased with the accommodation provided for him, and Jack felt a proud satisfaction at being able to carry home his intended bride on board his own ship. We must leave them to make the passage, forgetful of the possible storms and the many dangers to which those who voyage upon the fickle ocean are exposed, and follow Adair on board the Gleam. On touching at Gibraltar, Adair saw by the papers that the Giaour, instead of being paid off, was ordered to proceed to the Cape, and as far as he could make out, Murray still commanded her. "Poor Alick!" he exclaimed. "I thought he would now be allowed to remain on shore and enjoy the society of his wife. There are plenty of other fellows who are not so blessed, who would have been delighted to supersede him." Adair was beginning to sympathize with his Benedict friend, hoping as he did, in spite of adverse circumstances, ere long to belong to that fraternity. While in harbour he had a strict eye kept on Tom, who, though by this time he had regained his usual temper, might, he thought, if possible, take it into his head to try and make his way back to the Crimea. After getting through the straits and when to the northward of the latitude of Cadiz, the ship encountered unusually bad weather. Instead of improving, it became worse and worse. 2 of her boats were washed away, the wheel and the steering apparatus damaged, and numerous other injuries were received. She would indeed have been compelled to put into Cadiz had not the wind shifted to the southward, when, setting her close-reefed topsails, she ran on before the gale. "Well, old friend, our sweethearts and wives have got hold of the tow-ropes, and are hauling us along at a famous rate," observed Desmond to Tom. "Don't talk about that sort of thing to me," answered Tom gloomily. "I have no sweetheart or wife in England to tow me along. I am only getting farther and farther from all I hold dear." At hearing this, Gerald burst into a hearty fit of laughter. Tom at first felt inclined to quarrel with him, but a poke in the ribs from his messmate and the word humbug made him instead join in Desmond's cachinnations. Adair had invited his midshipman to dine with him, and had by his kind remarks succeeded in driving Tom's absurd notions out of his head. Tom, who really felt grateful to him, talked cheerfully of home, and of the pleasure he expected to enjoy on returning there. It was Tom's first watch. Shortly after sunset, he and the second lieutenant, who was officer of the watch, were seen standing on the bridge. The weather had somewhat moderated during the evening, but it had now come on to blow harder than ever, and the ship seemed suddenly to have entered a wild region of tossing, tumbling waves. Adair had left the deck for a few minutes to obtain some refreshment, for he saw that the night was likely to prove a boisterous one, and he intended, as every good commander will do under such circumstances, to remain on deck. He hurried over his meal. Indeed, there was no temptation to spend any longer time over it, as even the puddings and fiddles could scarcely keep the articles on the table. He had rung for his steward to clear away, to avoid that operation being performed by the eccentric movements of the billows, and was going towards the door of the cabin, when the ship received a tremendous blow, which made her quiver from stem to stern. At the same time loud cries reached his ears. He sprang on deck, when, glancing toward the bridge, he saw his second lieutenant alone standing there. "Man overboard!" shouted several voices. "Who is it?" he asked. "Mr. Rogers, sir," was the answer. "He was on the bridge a moment ago, and he isn't there now." "There he is! There he is!" shouted someone, and a figure was seen struggling on the foamy crest of a sea. Adair had made his way aft to the life buoy, and pulling both the lanyards as he dropped into the ocean, a bright light burst forth from its center. For one moment he gazed at it. He recollected that Tom was Lucy's brother. He had been committed to his charge. Without aid he would be unable to reach the buoy. Could I allow him to perish without an attempt to save him? These thoughts flashed through his mind far more rapidly than it has taken to record them, and without considering the fearful risk he was running, shouting to his first lieutenant to lower a boat, he plunged overboard, and was seen buffeting the tumbling seas and making his way towards the midshipman, who, catching sight of him, cried out, "All right, I see the life buoy, and soon shall be up to it." Adair, believing that he said this to prevent him from exhausting himself by making efforts to assist him, contented himself by treading water and throwing off his coat, that he might be able to swim to Tom's assistance, should he prove after all unable to reach the life-buoy. The ship, meantime, was running on before the gale, and minutes which seemed hours passed by before her canvas could be reduced, and she could be rounded to enable a boat to be lowered. Besides the regular boat's crews, who stood collected between two of the guns, ready for instant service, numerous volunteers had come forward, as is always found to be the case whenever there is work to be performed. The two lieutenants stood together. "We shall sacrifice the boat's crew and boat if we make the attempt," observed the first lieutenant. "Still, I wish to obey the commander's orders." The first lieutenant and master were both of opinion that a boat could not live in such a sea. The discussion was brief, but it lost time, and every moment was of consequence. "Surely, sir, you're going to lower a boat," cried Desmond, who observed the hesitation of his superiors. "You can't be letting my uncle and Tom Rogers drown without an attempt to save them, so myself would go in her, even if I go alone." And without further remark he sprang to the lee side, where several of the crew were already collected. "I'll go also, at all risk," cried the boatswain. "Who'll go with me and Mr. Desmond?" The crew were standing ready with the falls in their hands. He selected 6 of the best men, but as they were on the point of leaping into the boat, a sea struck her, and lifting her bows unhooked the forward fall. In the next instant she was dashed to fragments against the side. "I should be throwing away your lives, my lads, to lower another boat," cried the first lieutenant, as he saw the crews running to the after-quarter boat. "Very sad, but it can't be helped. We must look after the ship, or she'll be in a scrape presently." By this time the light from the life-buoy was no longer visible, and even had a boat been lowered, it would have been difficult, if not almost impossible, to find it. The order was given to brace round the head-yards, the helm was put up, and the ship was kept on her course, running before the wind. Several seas struck her, carrying away 2 more of her boats, and committing further damage. Had not the hatches been battened down, so tremendous was the quantity of water which flooded her decks that she would in all probability have foundered. Still the men talked and grumbled, and asked whether all had been done that was possible to save their commander and the midshipmen. Poor Desmond was in a fearful state of grief. He declared, perhaps unjustly, that all had not been done, and that the ship ought not to have left the spot without, at all events, searching for the life-buoy, and endeavoring, should the commander and Tom have been found clinging to it, to get them on board. The night was unusually dark, so that had the light not continued burning, this would have been impossible. The weather, contrary to expectation, again moderated. Desmond thought that even now they ought to put back and try to find the life-buoy. He expressed his opinion very strongly to the first lieutenant. "You are using very unwarrantable language, young gentleman," was the answer. "I overlook it, as you naturally feel grieved at the loss of your uncle and friend, but I am the person to judge what is right to do. And I should not have been warranted in risking the lives of the crew, even to attempt saving that of the commander." Poor Desmond was silenced, and though quite indifferent to the consequences, he felt that he had already gone further than he ought to have ventured. He was unable to recover his spirits during the remainder of the passage. He could scarcely say whether he was most sorry to lose his uncle or Tom Rogers, who was to him more even than a brother. From their earliest days, with slight intervals, they had been shipmates and friends. Then, again, he thought of the grief Tom's death would cause at Halliburton, and he had a slight inkling of the engagement between Lucy Rogers and his uncle, and having faith in the tender nature of young ladies' hearts, he fully believed that hers would be broken. He had read Falconer's Shipwreck, and remembered the lines, "With terror pale unhappy Anna read," as she received the news of Palamon's loss. At length the ship reached Portsmouth, and was ordered at once to go into harbor. Desmond, to whom the first lieutenant had been very civil during the remainder of the voyage, asked leave to go on shore, that he might communicate the sad news to Admiral Triton, should he be at Southsea, and get him to break it to Tom's family. The first lieutenant, who also knew of Adair's engagement to Miss Rogers, very willingly gave him leave, for though he had acted according to the best of his judgment in not making further efforts to pick up his commander, he could not help reflecting that censorious remarks might be made on his conduct, and he was anxious to avoid any bad construction being put upon it. Gerald hurried on shore, and made his way as fast as he could to Southsea. On reaching the Admiral's house, he was at once admitted and ushered into the drawing-room, where he found Miss Deborah and Mrs. Murray seated at the tea-table, and almost before he had time to open his mouth, the Admiral stumped into the room. "Who are you?" he asked, examining his features. "I know you. You need not tell me. You are my old friend Paddy Adair's nephew. I remember him when he was much younger than you are, and your jibs are cut much alike. He sent you with a message, I suppose, paying off his ship. He couldn't come himself? We shall see him soon, however. He'd have come fast enough had he supposed that a certain young lady was staying here." Not till now could Desmond get in a word. "I am sorry to say, sir, that I bring very sad news," answered Gerald, and he briefly described what had occurred. The Admiral, who had been standing up, tottered back into a chair as he heard it. "I won't believe it," he exclaimed at last. "Your uncle and Tom can't be lost. Poor Lucy, and my friend Sir John and Lady Rogers. They'll be dreadfully cut up at the loss of that fine youngster, Tom." "It mayn't have been your fault, Desmond, but I wonder you didn't try and save him." "I'd have risked my own life to do so, sir," answered Gerald, and he explained more fully all that had taken place. "I must go on board and make inquiries about the affair," exclaimed the Admiral. "Deb, help me on with my greatcoat." "Pray do not think of going, Admiral. It is too late in the day, and you are not fit for such a walk," said the old lady, without moving from her chair. Desmond had remarked the wondering way in which the Admiral had spoken, as also there was a great change in his appearance. He assured him that there was no possible use in going on board, and persuaded him at length to give up the idea. He grew more quiet and reasonable after he had taken a cup of tea, and observed with a sigh that it was high time he should slip his cable, since so many of his younger friends were losing the number of their mess. "And now, youngster," he asked, "what are you going to do with yourself when your ship is paid off, which I suppose she will be in a day or two? Have you any friends to go to?" Desmond owned that without his uncle he should be very unwilling to return to Ballymacree, and he thought that the best thing he could do would be to get afloat again as soon as possible. "You are right, youngster, depend on that," said the Admiral, "but in the meantime you must come and hang your hammock up here, and my sister Deborah will take care of you." Desmond, of course, accepted the Admiral's kind offer, and made himself very useful by walking out with the old man, who was now unfit to go out by himself, while he also made an excellent listener to his long yarns. The next day Mrs. Murray, who sympathized greatly with poor Lucy, and Sir John and Lady Rogers, wrote to Mary that she might break the intelligence to them, which they thus fortunately heard before they saw it in the papers. Desmond found that Murray had sailed but a short time before, but was expected back again shortly, when Mrs. Murray hoped that the ship would be paid off. Some time passed away. Though Desmond frequently spoke of trying to get a ship, the Admiral always replied that there would be time enough by and by, and that a spell on shore would do him no harm. They were one day walking across Southsea Common, intending to go to some shops in the High Street, when Desmond caught sight of 3 officers, whom he saw by their uniforms were commanders, walking along at a rapid rate towards them. A 4th, in a midshipman's uniform, at that moment came up from behind them. The Admiral had just before stopped to take a breath while he leant upon Desmond's arm. The astonishment Gerald felt made him gasp almost as much as the Admiral when he recognized Commanders Murray and Rogers and his uncle Terence, with Tom Rogers, both of them as alive and hearty as they had ever been. He could not restrain a shout of joy as the fact burst on his mind, though the Admiral's arm prevented him from rushing forward as he was inclined to do. "I knew it, I was sure of it," cried the Admiral, as he shook the hands of the whole party. "Now let me hear all about it. We'll not go into Portsmouth today, Desmond. Come back with me, come back with me. You'll make the ladies as happy as crickets, and restore my little friend Lucy to life. By the last account she was in a sad way. Sir John and Lady Rogers are very little better, grieving over you, you rascal Tom. Poor Mary had enough to do in looking after them. Now I think of it, Lucy was to be with us this very day, so you are in luck, Adair, though we must break the news to her gently, or we shall be sending her into hysterics and doing all sorts of mischief. As for you, Murray, I'm pretty sure are eager to see your wife. We'll let you go on first, for she expects you, It won't have the same effect on her." Murray gladly followed the Admiral's advice, and hurried on to his house, leaving the rest of the party to stroll slowly along. Adair then narrated the wonderful way in which he and Tom had been preserved. Tom, though a good swimmer, was almost exhausted when Adair made his way up to him and assisted him to reach the life buoy, of which they both managed to get their arms. To their dismay, they saw the ship running away from them till she disappeared in the darkness. At length, however, they again caught sight of her as she rounded to a long way to leeward. The light burned but dimly amid the mass of spray which surrounded it, and they knew that their voices would be drowned in the loud howling of the tempest should they exert them ever so much. They waited, therefore, still hoping against hope that the ship would make her way up to them. Adair well knew the difficulty she would have in finding them, and the fearful danger there would be in lowering a boat. He even doubted whether he would have made the attempt himself. Still, neither he nor Tom gave way to despair. They both hung on securely to the life buoy, and felt little or no exhaustion. They kept their eyes fixed on the ship, believing to the last that she would stand down to them. At length she disappeared in the darkness, and Adair knew that his first lieutenant, despairing of finding them, had borne up. "I did not blame him, for I knew he had done his best," he said. "My only fear was that an attempt had been made to lower a boat, and that some of my poor fellows might have lost their lives in trying to save us." Hour after hour went by. Tom kept up his spirits wonderfully, and I did my best to keep up mine and to cheer him. I thought of a good many things during that period. Indeed, it seemed to me that I was living my life over again. We were looking out anxiously for morning, in the hopes that we might be seen by some passing ship, when Tom cried out that he saw a steamer standing right for us. She came near. We shouted at the top of our voices, which were still pretty strong. When not half a cable's length from us, what was our joy to see her stop her way and alter her course so as to avoid running us down. When just abreast of us, a boat was lowered, and on being taken on board, great was our surprise to find ourselves on the deck of the Giles. It was only equalled by that of Murray at seeing us. We had no opportunity of sending home information of our merciful preservation, and as Murray had to sail again at once, we, as you see, were the first to bring home intelligence of our safety. "And thankful I am, my boy, that you have escaped," exclaimed the Admiral, again wringing Adair's and Tom's hands. "Well, Commander Jack, and what have you to say for yourself? I suppose you will be starting immediately for Halliburton?" "That must depend upon the arrangements of Colonel Giffard and his daughter, who took a passage home in my ship," answered Jack. "My belief is that they will return home shortly, to make arrangements for an event which is to come off early next month, which is no other than my marriage with Julia Giffard. Adair has promised to be my best man, and I know I may trust to your coming, Admiral?" "Not unless Sir John and Lady Rogers consent to allow Adair to take a leading part in another event of the same description. And I will now tell you, Adair, what I've done. I have left you half my property, provided you marry Lucy Rogers within 6 months. That is to say, if she wishes to have you, or in case you should decline, I left it to her to console her for your ill treatment." "You are indeed most kind and generous," exclaimed Adair, wringing the Admiral's hand. "As to that, I don't know that it is any great exertion of generosity," answered the Admiral, "considering that I can't take my money away with me, and that I have no relative except Deborah to whom I am bound in any way to leave it. She'll do what she thinks fit with the other half, either will it away to a hospital for dogs and cats, or leave it to those whom she thinks it may most benefit." The meeting of Adair and Lucy need not be described. Murray and Jack paid off their ships, when the former, instead of returning immediately, as he had intended, to Barcaldine, accepted an invitation to spend some weeks at Halliburton. The double marriages took place, when, after the pleasantest time they had ever spent together, the three commanders separated, Murray going with his wife and family to his Highland home, where shortly afterwards Jack and Terence, who were on their wedding tours, paid them a visit. Ben Snatchblock, who had been appointed to the charge of the Stella, had got her trim and taut as ever, and many a pleasant cruise did the old shipmates take together on board her, sometimes accompanied by their wives, and sometimes alone. Which proved the pleasantest trips of the two we cannot venture to say, But undoubtedly on the latter occasions there was more fun and frolic on board the craft, while many a yarn of old days was spun, in which Ben took his part. They were all, indeed, supremely happy, with no cares or responsibilities to trouble them. But the pleasantest of times must come to an end, and again the old friends parted, Jack and Terence going south with their brides to finish their promised rounds of visits, while Alick and Stella remained at Birkaldine, very naturally hoping that nothing, for a long time to come, might compel them to leave it. End of section 31.
Section 32 of the Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 23. Those lords of the Admiralty are the most horribly cruel, tyrannical, hard-hearted set I ever heard of. Why could they not have appointed another officer who is not just married? There are numbers of single men who would have been delighted to take command of the Dragon, and to think of their sending you, my dear, dear Jack, all the way out to the Pacific for I don't know how many years, among coral reefs and cannibals, and all sorts of fearful dangers. And Mrs. Jack Rogers put her handkerchief to her eyes and sobbed as if her heart would break. Her husband, who held an official-looking letter which he had just read in his hand, looked as he felt much distressed, but at the same time it never occurred to him that he could possibly refuse the appointment to the fine new screw steamer which had just been offered him, although her destination was the Pacific, and she might be kept out there 3 or 4 years. It was the first trial of his married life, a very great one, and he had had no other as yet to break him in. He in vain tried to comfort his young wife. It was very, very hard to them both, and indeed it was very difficult to discover any sort of comfort, and the more he said, the more poor Julia wept. Could you not say that under your circumstances you would rather be appointed to the Coast Guard? She exclaimed at length. Then you might stay at home, and I should not be separated from you in the unnatural way the Admiralty propose. It would be equivalent to desiring to be shelved, and I aspire to become a post-captain and to get my flag some day, answered Jack. Our case is not worse than that of many others. Some friends of mine have been sent off to sea a few days only after they have been married. It was a shame then, and they had no business to go, answered Julia indignantly. I wonder how those horrid lords themselves would like being separated from their wives, unless, as is possible, they are incapable of feeling the slightest love for them. I assure you, my dear Julia, that though in the aggregate they are somewhat inconsiderate of the feelings of naval officers, they are individually as amiable gentlemen and affectionate husbands as any other men, said Jack. My friend Tom Summers, one of the most lucky dogs in the service, who was a post-captain at 25, tells a capital story on the subject. He is, I must confess, impudence personified. He was one day at the Admiralty complaining to one of the lords, much in the way that you are now doing, of their want of consideration for the feelings of junior officers. The lord heard him out, and then asked him to come and dine with him, which Tom condescended to do, and a very good dinner with a number of excellent wines he enjoyed. His host produced one bottle after the other, of different descriptions, and of the choicest. And you like my wines? He asked. Excellent, all of them, sir, answered Tom. I shouldn't mind dining with you once a week while I remain on shore. Very well, answered the lord, but as I am leaving home, and cannot have the pleasure of seeing you, I'll send you a bottle, and you shall tell me how you like it. The next day Tom received a bottle, tied significantly round with red tape, for his host was somewhat of a wag. On tasting it, Tom poured out a glass and drank it off, but the instant afterwards he regretted his precipitancy, for he declared that he had never tasted anything so execrable. Just then his friend looked in upon him "Well, Summers, how did you like my wine?" he asked. "I can't say that I ever wish to take another drop of it," answered Tom. "Well, I sent you exactly the wines you tasted at my house," answered his visitor. "You, however, drank them separately. I mixed them together, and you complain of the result. Now, if you take each of us lords by ourselves, you will find us as well disposed and amiable as most other men, but when we act together, we put aside all the gentle feelings of our nature, and form the stern, unrelenting body you and others find us. I believe, Julia, Tom gave a very exact description of the Admiralty, and however much some of the lords might be disposed to befriend me individually, I should ruin myself in the service were I to plead that I have just married a wife, and would rather not go to sea." "Then there is no chance of your getting some other appointment?" asked Julia, in a faltering tone. "Not the slightest, I'm afraid," answered Jack. "However, we must make the best of a bad case. Some weeks may pass before the ship is ready for sea, and perhaps before that time you will have got tired of me." Julia gave a melancholy smile as she looked up in her husband's face. "I'm jealous of Lucy," she said after some time. "I suppose the Admiralty will not also be appointing Commander Adair to a ship?" "I'm not so certain of that," said Jack. "I know that they talk of sending out several to put a stop to the kidnapping system which as of late prevailed in the Pacific, as also to keep some of the Black and Brown Island chiefs in order, and they may fix on Adair as likely as on any one else." "Poor Lucy," said Julia. "I'm sure that I don't really wish her to share my fate." This conversation took place at Colonel Gifford's, where Jack and his bride were staying. The very next day he got a letter from Adair, who with Lucy was at South Sea, saying that he had been appointed to the Aeolus to proceed forthwith to the Pacific station. "Lucy behaves capitally, like a sailor's wife, and says she knows I ought to go, though it is a cruel affair to us both. However, Jack, I know that you will compassionate us, and that your wife will do her best to comfort her when I am away. I tell her that I have hopes of coming back in a couple of years, as I will try at the end of that time to get superseded, which, with the help of the Admiral, I hope I may succeed in doing." "Poor Lucy," said Julia, "we must support each other. But when we married, I little thought such would be our fate." Jack, of course, took his wife down to South Sea, as fortunately for him the Dragon was fitting out at Portsmouth, as was also the Aeolus, the young ladies having got over their first sensations of grief when they met, wisely determined to make the most of their husbands during the time they remained with them. The Aeolus was almost ready for sea, and sailed about a fortnight after Adair had commissioned her. Curiously enough, Desmond had been previously appointed to her, so he once more accompanied his uncle. The Dragon was not ready till the week afterwards. Jack was glad to get Joss Green as master, with Mr. Mildmay as his first lieutenant. His brother Tom, who had been taking a spell on shore, was appointed to her, and just before she sailed, Archie Gordon joined her. Dick Needham, though eligible for a much higher rate, had joined as gunner, with Mr. Large, who had been with Jack in the Gauntlet, as boatswain. When it was known that Jack was to command the Dragon, several old shipmates volunteered, Jerry Bird and Tim Nolan among them. Tom was much pleased to have his old messmate, Billy Blueblazes. Dickie Duff had joined the Aeolus. Altogether Jack was well satisfied with his officers and ship's company. We cannot venture to describe the parting, as it might be too touching to the feelings of our fair readers. Lucy, having had to undergo the same ordeal just before, was able to console her sister-in-law. Jack's manly heart felt very full, but he tore himself away, and hastening on board ordered the ship which was at Spithead to be got under way. Round went the men at the capstan, the merry pipes sounding, and under all sail the Dragon stood down channel. She was directed not to use her coal except in case of necessity. Having touched at Madeira, where she took in a cask of wine for the Admiral, and oranges enough to keep scurvy at bay for many a month, and having sighted the Cape de Verdes in the distance, she stood across to Rio. That city had improved greatly since Jack was last there, the enlightened Emperor being the advocate of liberal institutions, which have done much to advance the social as well as the material interests of the inhabitants. Mildmay, who still, notwithstanding he was first lieutenant, indulged his poetical fancies, wrote a sonnet on the benign rule of the Emperor, which, unfortunately, having been blown overboard, cannot be given. Touching at the Falkland Islands for a supply of fresh beef and vegetables, the Dragon steered for the Straits of Magellan, which Jack had determined to run through. She called off Sandy Point near the eastern entrance of the straits, where the Chilean government had formed a settlement for the purpose of working a coal mine. Some copper-colored natives with broad faces and high cheekbones, and dressed in guanaco robes and skin boots, came off to the ship principally to obtain some liquor, though they brought some ostrich, fox, and guanaco skins to exchange for guns and gunpowder or spirits. The passage of the straits being broad and well known, the ship steamed rapidly on till she reached Cape Pillar at the western end, beyond which the Pacific Ocean burst on their view. Instead, however, of entering it, she steered north into Smith's Channel, the southern end of a passage which runs due north between the mainland and a chain of islands 200 miles in length. Nothing could be grander than the scenery which those on board the Dragon beheld as the ship threaded her way through this intricate channel, with the islands on the left hand and lofty snow-capped mountains towering up on the right. As she proceeded northward, their bases appeared covered with trees, reaching almost to the water's edge, deep bays and gulfs running up far inland. Indeed, the whole scenery was grand and beautiful. It required careful steering and a bright lookout ahead to avoid running on shore, a hot tide being frequently met with, which might quickly have whirled the ship round on the rocks. At length, a heavy gale blowing outside, in order to avoid it, she ran through a narrow passage and entered a small harbour known as Connor Cove. The mountains, thickly covered with trees for some distance up, rose around the harbour, their snowy summits towering to the sky. The scene was grand and sombre, a few seabirds only appearing, who with their loud, wild shrieks increased its melancholy character. Though several of the officers landed, they could make no progress through the dense forest, the whole ground being one mass of rotten timber, amid which grew ferns and moss of various descriptions. Here, though the gale raged overhead, she lay as securely as in a dock, moored by the stern with a hawser to a large tree on shore. The gale having ceased, steam was again got up, and about 40 miles on she entered the open sea and passed several Chilean towns, the most northern being Lota and Coronel, at both of which places extensive coal mining operations were carried on. At the latter, the Dragon took in a fresh supply of coal, which would carry her, if properly husbanded, across the Pacific. Steaming northward, she entered the Bay of Valparaiso, which Tom, as he looked at the barren, red and bare hills surrounding it, with scarce a bush except the cactus to be seen, pronounced a very odd sort of paradise. The town stands partly on the shores of the bay, and chiefly on a number of hills, separated by valleys, with the mighty Cordilleras rising beyond, giving the scenery, in spite of the barren aspect of the foreground, a grand and picturesque character. The bay was full of vessels, showing that a considerable amount of trade is carried on in the place. Jack and his officers received numerous invitations, both from the English merchants and the native residents of rank, a ball being given by them in honour of the Dragon's officers, at which Tom lost his heart, as did several of his companions theirs. "What, you don't mean to say you have forgotten the fair Feodorovna?" said Archie, as Tom was expatiating on the beauty of the black-eyed damsel who had attracted his admiration. "Well, as you know, she is in another hemisphere, and as I never expect to see her again, and she has probably forgotten me, I don't think I ought to wear the willow for her any longer," said Tom. "And Dona Serafina is, you'll allow, very beautiful." "Granted," answered Archie, "but as the ship sails tomorrow, and Dona Serafina will probably forget you in the course of a day or two, even if she happens to distinguish you from the rest of us, you'll not, I hope, break your heart about her." "Not if we happen to touch at another port soon, and a ball is given to us there," said Tom with a demure look, "provided I have the luck to meet a partner with attractions equal to Dona Serafina's." "You're all right, my lad," said Archie, clapping him on the back, "and Mr. Malmay won't have to write your epitaph, hic jacet, Tom Rogers, who died of a broken heart, etc., etc." About 3 weeks after this, the Dragon entered the Bay of Callao, passing around the barren island of San Lorenzo, long the burying place of Protestants who were denied sepulture on the mainland. At the farther end of the plain, between the lofty Cordilleras and the shore, could be seen the spires and fanes of Pizarro's city of 1,000 towers and 100 gates, while on the island were basking numbers of drowsy seals and sea lions, with sleek skins and shaggy manes. The ship came to an anchor about a mile from the mole, outside the merchant vessels. Jack had been looking out for the Aeolus and was somewhat disappointed at not hearing of her at any of the ports at which he had touched. As they had been ordered to cruise in company, he determined to wait here for her. This gave an opportunity to several of the officers to visit Lima. Those who went there pronounced the city a very fine one, and declared that it was more worthy to be called the Vale of Paradise than the Chilean town to the southward. The ship had been there some days, when some time after sunset a schooner was observed gliding into the harbour. She came to an anchor among several other vessels, which concealed her from sight. Jack, who had been on deck enjoying the cool air of the evening, was about to turn in when the sentry hailed a small boat which was seen approaching. An English voice answered and asked leave to come on board. It was granted, and a middle-aged seafaring man stepped up the side. "Who are you, and what do you want, my man?" asked Jack. "Please you, sir, I'm an Englishman. My name is Ralph Hake, of Plymouth, and I belonged till half an hour ago to a Peruvian schooner, the Saltador, which now lies inside of us, but I've taken French leave of her and don't want to go back," answered the man. "A very clear statement of yours, but what brought you on board this ship?" asked Jack. "Because I had nowhere else to go to, sir, and that's why. I'd like to enter with you, sir. I'm sick of the craft I was serving aboard, and of the work she was carrying on," answered the man. "What was that?" asked Jack. "Just kidnapping poor natives in the different islands away to the westward whenever she could get hold of them, and bringing them here as slaves to labour in the mines, or at any other task their masters may think fit to put them to," answered Hake. "You see, sir, I was left on shore sick from a whaler, which, as she never came back for me, was, I suppose, lost, and as I was starving, not knowing how this craft was to be employed, I shipped on board her, being promised high wages, and thinking I should like the trip, but when I came to see the sort of work she was carrying on, I made up my mind to leave her on the first opportunity, though I never found that till tonight, when getting hold of the dinghy which was alongside, I slipped my bag into her, and pulled away before anyone found me out. I can tell you, sir, I never saw more cruel work than that craft carried on. When the skipper could, he enticed the natives on board, and clapped them under hatches. Sometimes he pretended to trade with them, and got them below under the pretence of looking at his goods. At others he asked them into the cabin to have a bit of something to eat, and making them drunk, slipped their hands into handcuffs before they knew what was happening. At some places where this did not answer, he sent the boat's crews armed on shore, and seized as many as he could fall in with, and not unfrequently took the people out of fishing canoes, which he sent to the bottom. I've known him run down 3 or 4 canoes, one after the other, to get hold of some of the people in them, not minding what became of the rest. At one place the people must have been Christians, for when we went on shore we found a number of them in a large chapel, and a brown man preaching to them. We got hold of nearly a score, and when their friends attempted to rescue them, we shot or cut down all who interfered, and carried away a dozen or more. When we got them on board, instead of complaining, they sat together and sang psalms, and one of them, who I found knew a little English, talked to me and told me that 2 of their number were elders of their church, and that he and all the rest were Christians. When I told the skipper, he only laughed, and said that they were only Protestants, and that when they got on shore the priest would make them into real Christians. The native, when I told him this, sighed, and said he hoped he and his friends would remain faithful. On another occasion we enticed a whole fleet of canoes some distance off the shore. When they, taking the alarm, were pulling back, he fired among them, and when they took fright and were paddling away, we sunk the whole of them, giving some the stem, throwing shot into others, and firing at the rest. We picked up as many people as we could, but not a few were drowned, and the remainder managed to swim on shore. At last, with a full cargo, though some died on board, we came in here. I found that this was not the first trip on this business the schooner had made, and that half a dozen more craft were employed in the same way, so that many hundreds of the poor natives must have been carried off from their homes to die up among the snowy mountains of cold, starvation, and hard work, or else of broken hearts. This is important information, my man. You should at once have informed the consul, who might have taken steps to get the natives liberated," observed Jack. If I had gone on shore, sir, I should have had a sharp knife stuck under my ribs before I was many hours older, answered Hake. By that time, and long before the consul could have interfered, the whole cargo would have been miles away up the country. Even now there is not one left in the schooner. Jack reflected on what the man had told him, and believing the account, gave him leave to remain on board during the night, resolving to look into the matter the next morning. A hand was sent to secure his punt, but it was found that when he stepped out of her he had given her a shove and sent her drifting away, and she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning Jack went on shore to communicate with the acting consul, who acknowledged that he had had information on the subject, but though aware that several vessels had been fitted out for the purpose mentioned, he had been unable to take any steps for putting a stop to their proceedings. "Then I must see what we can do," exclaimed Jack indignantly. "If we can find out from what islands people have been taken and the inhabitants ask for our protection, we shall have the right to afford them all the assistance in our power. You may be very certain, should you seize any vessels engaged in carrying off the natives, no one will interfere, for their government, even should they be aware of their proceedings, will not dare to acknowledge that they are so or protect them, and I am very sure that the French will be ready to assist in capturing the villains who may have ventured to visit any of the islands under their rule," observed the consul. "Then I will go to Tahiti and ascertain what the French government knows about the matter," said Jack. "Possibly on my way I may fall in with some of the kidnappers, and it will be a satisfaction to release the slaves they may have taken and to put a stop to their proceedings." That evening the ship sailed for the westward. A lookout was kept for any craft which might answer to Hake's description of the vessels engaged in the traffic. The Dragon had been nearly 3 weeks at sea when a vessel was seen ahead, steering to the eastward. As she drew nearer, she was seen to be a brigantine, and Hake declared that she was one of the vessels sent out to collect natives. Hopes were entertained that she might have some on board, and that they should have the pleasure of releasing them and taking them back to their homes, if such could be found. As the Dragon drew nearer, Jack made a signal for the stranger to heave to, and as she did not appear to understand it, he fired a shot across her bows, which had the desired effect. A boat was lowered, and Giles Green with Tom and Archie was sent to examine her, and should natives be found, to bring her close up to the ship so that they might be transferred on board. Giles and his companions pulled away in high glee, fully hoping that they should have the satisfaction of liberating some of their fellow creatures. "It is too bad," observed Green, "that we should be spending our energies on the west and east coasts of Africa, and all the time that these degenerate descendants of Spaniards out here in the Pacific should be endeavouring to drag our fellow creatures into a far worse slavery than the Africans have to endure. These poor islanders, accustomed to the perfect freedom of the breezes of the ocean, must perish miserably in the course of a few months if compelled to work in the mines, or even in the fields on the mainland." "I think we should be right to hang up their captors at their own yardarms and send their vessels to the bottom," cried Tom indignantly. Archie, though he doubted the legality of the proceeding, perfectly agreed with Tom that it would be a just punishment for the kidnappers. 6 ruffianly-looking fellows, one of whom appeared to be the master, most of them having their heads or arms bandaged up as if they had been wounded, received them on deck. The master pointed to the Peruvian flag and inquired why he was stopped on his voyage. "I'll tell you when we've examined your craft," answered Green. "You'd better not go into the forecastle where we have 5 of our men suffering from the smallpox," said the skipper. "And how many have you in the hold?" asked Green, who knew Spanish sufficiently to carry on a conversation. "We have no one there, but you had better not go into it, for some have died there of smallpox, and you may carry the disease on board your own ship," answered the skipper. "We will run the risk," said Green. "Take off the hatches, and I'll go below." As no one seemed inclined to obey him, he ordered his own men to lift off the hatches. He and Tom, with 2 of the men, went below, while Archie with the rest remained on deck, keeping an eye upon the Peruvian crew, who, as Tim Nolan observed, looked as if they were after mischief. The hold was empty, but it was evidently fitted for passengers, or rather for slaves. "What are all those dark marks?" asked Tom. "Bloodstains," answered Green, examining them. "And see, here are bullets sticking in the deck and timbers. The wood has been splintered in all directions. Depend on it, there has been some desperate work going on. I believe that the account of the smallpox was false, was merely given to try and prevent us from examining the craft." "You found no one, as I told you," said the skipper when Green returned on deck. "No, but we have found enough to convince us that you have murdered the unhappy wretches you induced to come on board," answered Green. "You should rather say Our passengers treacherously rose on us, and we had to fight in self-defence, said the skipper, forgetting what he had said about the smallpox. And your men forward are suffering from the wounds they received, said Green. Such is the case, but I was ashamed to acknowledge how nearly we were defeated by the savages, said the master with the greatest coolness. Green accordingly went forward and found 5 men in their bunks, all badly wounded, 2 being nearly at the last gasp. I will bring the surgeon to dress their hurts, said Green, though if what I suspect is the case, you all deserve to be sent to the bottom, and depend on it we shall endeavour to get at the truth of the story, and you will hear more of the matter by and by. The master shrugged his shoulders, and Green, not thinking it prudent to leave anyone on board with such villains, returned with the midshipman to the ship to make his report. Jack was doubting how to proceed with the brigantine when her sails were let fall, and the breeze freshening she stood away to windward. As the Dragon had not even her fires lighted, there was but little chance of catching her, and Jack did not think it worth while to go in chase, as he felt pretty sure that she would not continue her kidnapping cruise. The next day the lookout announced that he saw a fleet of vessels ahead, a grove of palm trees rather, observed Green, laughing. As the ship rose and fell in the swell, the trees alternately disappeared and came into sight, and on getting nearer, a coral island hove in view. It consisted of a ring a quarter of a mile or so in width, with a lagoon in the centre. First was seen a line of surf, then a white sandy beach, and beyond a belt of green ground, sparsely sprinkled with cocoanut and pandanus trees, and here and there with a few bushes of low growth. The ship stood along the shore at a respectful distance, a lookout being kept for inhabitants, as Jack thought it possible that if any of the people had escaped from the brigantine, they might have managed to effect a landing, the natives of these islands being generally first-rate swimmers. No one, however, was seen, and he feared that the whole of the kidnapped people must have perished. As he was unwilling to lose time by heaving to effect a landing, he stood on towards Tahiti. All hands were somewhat disappointed with the appearance of that island when they first came in sight of it, jagged peaks and rugged mountains being alone visible, for the shady groves and waterfalls, the verdant meadows and fields were not to be seen till the ship got close to the entrance of the harbour. Before them appeared a line of breakers, dashing in snow-white foam on the encircling reef of coral, with a lagoon of calm blue water within, out of which rose the shore, covered with the richest tropical vegetation, numberless vines and creeping plants, making their way up the hillsides, amid which sparkling cascades came falling down from the rugged mountains above. Well, after all, Tahiti does present a highly picturesque and beautiful landscape, exclaimed Mildmay, taking out his notebook, and I hope that we shall find the inhabitants living in that Arcadian simplicity appropriate to so lovely a region. Alas, they found but little Arcadian simplicity when they reached the shore. Guns frowned from the surrounding heights down on the harbour. The French flag flew from the battlements of the forts. French soldiers were everywhere seen. It was soon evident that the once free Tahitians were a conquered race. Jack lost no time in communicating with the French governor, who had already heard that many of the natives of the outlying islands under French protection had been carried off. He had already sent out 2 men of war to try and catch the kidnappers, and he expressed his wish heartily to cooperate with the English in putting a stop to so abominable a system. Jack, being satisfied that the French would attend to that part of the Pacific, determined to proceed to the westward, where the appearance of an English man-of-war might effect some good. The fires were lighted, and preparations were being made for weighing, when a column of smoke was seen in the distance, announcing the approach of a steamer. A French officer on board said that she must be direct from Europe, as none of their own cruisers were expected. Jack, hoping to obtain some news, accordingly awaited for her arrival. As she approached, she made the number of the Aeolus, soon coming to an anchor. Visits were exchanged between the 2 ships' companies. Adair told Jack that he had arrived at Callao the day after the Dragon had left, and that as soon as he could obtain fresh provisions and water, he had again sailed in search of him. The Aeolus had come round by the Cape, and had not entered the Pacific till 3 weeks after the Dragon. Jack agreed to wait till the Aeolus could take in provisions and water. The feeling with which the unjustifiable capture of Tahiti by the French had been regarded by the English had by this time subsided, and the officers of the 2 ships having been treated with all the civility the French were able to show, they left the harbour with some regret, as they were not likely to meet with any place so advanced in civilization before they reached Sydney. A voyage across the Pacific sounds very romantic, but there are often long distances to be traversed when no land is in sight, and there is nothing to break the monotony of the voyage. The midshipmen of the two ships voted it very dull, and began to believe that they should meet with none of the wonderful adventures which they had anticipated. Mr. Mildmay confessed that he had been dreadfully disappointed. He had expected everywhere to see bevies of graceful nymphs dressed in gossamer robes, their glossy hair decked with wreaths of bright flowers, and their necks and arms adorned with coral and precious stones. Instead of which, he declared that he had seen only a set of dowdy women with brown skins and without a particle of beauty to boast of. One thing, however, can be said of the inhabitants of these islands, observed Jack. Whereas a few years ago they were in heathen darkness, now, thanks to the exertions of the missionaries, heathenism has disappeared from all the islands to the southward, and if the people are not perfect Christians, they are at all events as much so as the great mass of people in Christendom. Jack was right. Indeed, they found missionaries established at all the principal islands at which they touched, with large chapels, well-built schoolhouses, and neat villages, the inhabitants being universally able to read and write, and many of them being well informed on various important subjects. After touching at several islands to the south and west of Tahiti, where not a single heathen remains, the ship steered for a harbour in one of the islands of the Samoan group. It was here that a boat's crew of the French navigator La Perouse were massacred. As they approached the islands, no sign of a harbour could be perceived, lofty cliffs towering up before them to the sky, without apparently a break. Still the Dragon stood on, followed by the Aeolus, two rocks appearing, one called the Tower Rock, and another on the opposite side, the Devil's Point, so well defined that Jack had no fears of mistaking the entrance. The sails were furled, and the steam got up. At length the ships entered a passage between the cliffs about a third of a mile in width till they reached a basin completely surrounded by lofty precipices from 800 to 1,000 feet in height. The lower portion of the rocks was bare, but their summits were clothed with the most luxuriant vegetation, magnificent tree ferns and cocoanut trees growing high up in situations in which they are seldom seen in other latitudes. No sooner had the ships dropped their anchors than they were surrounded by canoes full of natives, who, though they appeared to be merry fellows, were remarkably well behaved, all of them being also decently clothed. Several chiefs and others came on board, some of whom spoke English, and from them it was ascertained that the whole of the people were Christians, having long been under missionary influence. One of Jack's chief objects in entering the harbour was to ascertain whether any of the natives had been carried off. A strange vessel had appeared off the coast, and had attempted to entrap some lads fishing in a canoe, but they had been too wary to be so caught, and when a boat put off in chase of their canoe, they had made their way to the shore, though only just in time to escape capture. Jack issued a notice which he desired might be sent among all the islands of the group, warning the people against the various devices practised by the kidnappers. After a short time, the two ships again put to sea. End of Section 32.
Section 33 of The Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by LHardie, Calgary, Alberta. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston, Chapter 24, Part 1. The Dragon and Aeolus had been for some weeks at sea. The latter was to touch at various islands of the New Hebrides group, after which she was to proceed to the Loyalty Islands, to visit the Isle of Pines, Norfolk Island, and thence to go on to Sydney. The Dragon, meantime, was to continue her course to the northwest, visiting Santa Cruz, the Solomon Islands, New Ireland, and New Britain, and she was also to visit Sydney. Thence the two ships were to recross the Pacific to touch at the Sandwich Islands, and to go on to Vancouver's Island in British Columbia, after which all hands heartily hoped that they might be ordered home. The projected cruise was being discussed in the midshipman's berth, with the chart on the table. "It doesn't look so very far," observed Billy Blue Blazes, "though considering that we are to perform the distance under sail, it will take us some time, I suppose." "I rather think so, laddie," observed Archie, who had a pair of compasses in his hand, and was measuring off the distances. "We shall have run over between 60 and 70,000 miles of salt water before we drop anchor in Portsmouth Harbor. Not an inch less, according to my calculation. It should be enough to wear the sheathing off the ship's bottom if it were not pretty thick to begin with." Most of the islands the ship visited were lofty, the hills covered thickly with trees to their summits. They were surrounded by coral reefs through which, in many instances, no passage was to be found. Others had openings affording secure harbors within them. After visiting several small islands in the neighborhood, the ship came to an anchor in a sheltered harbor in the island of Santa Cruz. Canoes quickly gathered round her, full of the ugliest-looking natives they had yet met with. Their skin was nearly black, their heads covered with thick, woolly hair, their foreheads low and receding, their faces broad with high cheekbones, their noses flat, and their mouths large. They had adorned their bodies with various colors and ornamented themselves further with rings through their noses and ears, as also with armlets and necklaces of human teeth, the rest of their dress consisting only of a string round the waist, to which a small apron was secured. These unattractive-looking personages were considerably under the ordinary size, but appeared, notwithstanding the character bestowed on them of being the most cruel and treacherous in the Pacific Ocean, to be a good-tempered, merry race. They brought off large quantities of coconuts, bows, arrows, and mats, which they were willing to exchange for empty bottles, old clothes, and tobacco. As yet no missionaries having ventured among them, they were in the same savage state in which they had for centuries existed. In the evening those who had been allowed to come on board were turned out of the ship, and a bright lookout was kept against any treacherous trick they might have attempted to play. The fires had been let out, as Jack intended to remain during the day for the purpose of obtaining water. Early the next morning, a schooner was seen passing close in with the land. As the wind was light, Jack dispatched 2 boats to overhaul her. One was commanded by Green, who was accompanied by Archie, the other by Tom, who had Billy Blueblazes as his companion. They pulled away, hoping soon to overtake the stranger. When, however, they were about half a mile from her, a breeze sprang up, but as the boats had their sails, the masts were stepped, and they stood on after the chase. She took no notice of the musket which Green fired as a signal for her to heave to, but instead of doing so, she set more sail and stood on, this making him more suspicious than ever for her character. He determined to persevere, Tom and his companion being equally ready to continue the pursuit. "Perhaps she is a pirate," observed Billy, "and when she finds that she cannot get off, she will try to defend herself, and we shall have some fighting, something to vary the monotony of the voyage." "As to that, I doubt whether such craft are to be found in these seas at the present day," answered Tom, "and I rather think that if we can manage to get up to her, that she will strike, without firing a shot," and made him the more eager to overhaul her. At length her sails were seen to flap against her masts, and though the boat still had the breeze, it was very evident that she was becalmed. The sky had for some time been wearing a threatening aspect, and had not Green been so eager to overhaul the stranger, he would have endeavored to make the best of his way back to Santa Cruz. At length the wind dropped altogether, and, the sails being lowered, the crews of the boats gave way, with a certainty that they would at length get up for the chase. Each boat had 4 muskets. The officers had stuck their pistols in their belts, and the men had their cutlasses, weapons on which British seamen always placed more reliance than on firearms. They were now within gunshot of the schooner, but she did not fire, nor were there any signs visible that she intended to offer resistance. Green steered for the starboard quarter, and directed Tom to board on the port side. They were soon up with her. Tom and Billy, with 6 men, scrambled up on deck, which Green and his party gained at the same time, but, except for the man at the helm, 1 other forward, none of the crew were visible. The man at the helm looked very much astonished, and asked with cool effrontery what they wanted. Green replied that he must know where the schooner was from, whither she was bound, and what cargo she had on board. "The master will tell you all about it, sir," answered the man, "but he is at present below, sick with a bad leg." "Then I must pay him a visit and get him to show his papers," said Green, who, telling Tom and Billy to keep a watch on deck, went into the master's cabin with Archie and a couple of armed men. The master was sitting up in his cot, with a black boy attending on him. "Well, gentlemen, what do you want?" he asked, as Green and Archie entered. "Why did you run away from us?" asked Green, "when you must have seen that our boats were those of one of Her Majesty's ships of war?" "How would I tell what you were?" said the master. "You might be pirates. At all events, I have no wish to be stopped in my voyage." "Well, at any rate, show me your papers, and inform me of how many people you have on board, for as yet I have seen only a couple of hands," said Green. "We have upwards of 80, including passengers," answered the master. "I suppose the crew got out of the way lest you should fire at us, and for the same reason the passengers thought it prudent to keep below. Boy, take that tin out of the locker there, and give it to the officer." Green examined the document brought him. It set forth that the schooner Expert, Captain Toby, belonging to Brisbane, Queensland, had a license to trade for sandalwood, and to carry 100 passengers. "Well, your papers seem to be all very clear, and your passengers came on board with their own free will. I can have nothing to say to you but wish you a good voyage," he remarked. "But I would have been better pleased had you hove to when I made signal to you to do so, as you would have saved us a long pull." Captain Toby only grinned, as if he was well pleased at the trouble he had caused the man-of-war's officers. As they were speaking, two other men, who were apparently mates, came out of the side cabin yawning and stretching themselves in a way which somewhat tried Green's patience. "Well, I must beg your officers to show me your passengers and the rest of your crew before I quit you," he said, addressing the master. "I suppose you've got legal authority for what you are doing," said Captain Toby. "Certainly, and as we are in a hurry to be off, I must beg you to be smart about it," said Green, turning to the mates. "Come, my lads, I am only performing my duty, and that duty I intend to carry out." The two mates, seeing that the officer was not to be trifled with, went forward and summoned 8 ruffianly-looking fellows who had been stowed away in the forecastle. 3 or 4 were apparently Englishmen, the others black or brown men, one a Kanaka, the other a New Zealander. By the mate's orders, they lifted off the hatches and went below. Archie observed that they had the butts of pistols sticking out of the breasts of their shirts, and that all of them wore long knives in sheaths by their sides. There was some talking below, and one by one 60 black-skinned natives made their appearance on deck, and were ranged on either side. None of them had any other clothing beside a piece of matting or sailcloth round the waist. Unfortunately, Green had come away without an interpreter, but he did his best to try and ascertain from the natives if they were on board of their own free will. No one uttered a complaint, but he observed that the mates kept their eyes fixed on the blacks, who seemed to cower under their glance. He was still not satisfied, but he was unable to find any sufficient reason for detaining the vessel. On returning to the cabin, he found another individual who had not before appeared, seated at the table, busily employed in writing. "Our doctor, sir," said the master. "He has come with us for the sake of science, to gain a knowledge of the wild inhabitants of this region. He is a perfect slave to science. Are you not, doctor?" "It is the sole object of my life," answered the person who had been addressed, without rising from his seat. Though the man spoke with the accent of a gentleman, Green thought that he had seldom seen a more ill-looking individual. "Well, I hope you are satisfied, Mr. Officer," said the master at length, "and, if so, that you will allow us to fill our sails and stand on, for my mate tells me he doesn't like the look of the weather, and I'd advise you to make the best of your way back to your ship." Green saw indeed that it was important to get back, and he did not therefore waste words with the master or his ill-mannered surgeon. On returning on deck, he found that the mates had sent the blacks below again, while the crews were shortening sail. The weather had become rapidly worse. He could not help regretting that he had come so far from the island, with the prospect of a pull back through a heavy sea. He could not hoist the boats on board, or, under the circumstances, he might have compelled the schooner to beat back to Santa Cruz. Had he attempted to do so, and to tow the boats, they would, in all probability, have been swamped. "We must make the best of it," he said to Tom, who had for the last few minutes been feeling anything but comfortable about the matter. "A safe voyage to you, my friends," he said as he leaped into his boat. The mates made no reply, but as he shoved off he fancied that he heard a laugh, and at the same time he caught sight of the ill-favored visage of the scientific doctor looking over the quarter, while the schooner stood away to the southward. Scarcely, however, were they a quarter of a mile apart when the wind came down with greater force than before, and he found that it was impossible to make any headway against it. The nearest island was that of Tenacula. By running under its lee, he might get shelter for the night, but should an eruption occur, it would prove to be a dangerous neighborhood. There were other islands beyond, but they were surrounded by reefs, which might prevent the possibility of landing upon them, while from the savage character of the natives on the inhabited ones, they could only expect a hostile reception. "We'll try it a little longer, Rogers," sang out Green. "Perhaps the weather will moderate. If it grows worse, we must run under the lee of that burning mountain. We can only hope that it will remain quiet for a few hours." The weather did not moderate, and when the men had been pulling hard for a couple of hours without gaining ground, the boats' heads were put round, and with reefed sails they steered towards the eastern side of the mountain, Green intending to haul around it, so as to be able to anchor during the night under its lee. Night rapidly came down over the stormy ocean. The wind increased, and the seas came roaring up astern, threatening every instant to swamp them. Green led, Tom following in his wake. "I wish we hadn't been sent after that abominable slaver," exclaimed Billy, who was feeling more uncomfortable than he had ever before been in his life. "I wonder whether the ship will come to look after us." "Not likely," answered Tom. "As well hunt for a needle in a bundle of hay. She wouldn't know where to find us if she did. My brother trusts Green, who always knows what he's about, and he will not be unhappy on our account. We shall soon be under the lee of the island, and then we shall be snug enough, though, for my part, I would rather have been comfortably stowed away in my hammock." "You take things very coolly, Rogers," cried Billy. "Oh, look at that big sea. It will tumble aboard us in a moment." "If it does, you must stand by to bail it out," answered Tom. "Hold on, though, in case it should wash you overboard." Tom, who was grasping the helm with a firm hand, received the sea on the quarter. A portion of the crest broke over the boat. She, however, went gliding forward, while the sea roared on until it caught Green's boat, which appeared for a moment to be overwhelmed, but was seen directly afterwards rising on the summit of another wave, while Billy and the rest of Tom's crew bailed away with might and main, knowing the importance of freeing their boat before another sea broke into her. Thus on they rushed amid the dark, foam-crested waves. Several times they were treated in the same manner, but as quickly as the water entered it was hove out again. The darkness increased, and the dim outline of the mountain alone could be seen, its lofty summit towering to the clouds. Green was unwilling to keep further off the island than was necessary, but, at the same time, he thought it possible that a reef might extend some distance from it, on which, should the boat strike, they must inevitably be lost. A keen lookout was kept ahead, but nothing could be seen besides the dark, tumbling, foam-crested seas. It was a time to try the hearts of the stoutest. Gradually the island grew more and more distinct. "Haul off the sheet," cried Green, and the boat sailed on with the sea abeam. Now was the most dangerous time, for a sea striking the side might in an instant, without allowing anyone a chance of escaping, have capsized the boats and sent them to the bottom. The seas seemed to rush forward with greater fury even than before, as if eager to seize their prey before it had escaped them. Happily, it did not last long. On shooting under the lee of a lofty precipice which rose sheer out of the water, they were almost immediately becalmed, though still fearfully tumbled about by the waves as they swirled round the base of the cliff. "Get out your oars, my lads, and give way," cried Green. The order was quickly obeyed, and after pulling for a few hundred yards, the boats lay in comparatively calm water. The island mountain rose like a dark spectre above their heads, without any beach that could be discovered on which the boats could be hauled up, or any cove to afford them shelter. Green had a lead line on board, and it was let fall over the side, but no bottom was found. "Perhaps by pulling on a little further we may find some place in which we can bring up for the night. If not, we must keep the oars moving," said Green. They pulled on accordingly. "Hello!" cried Tom. "What's that?" The moment he spoke, a bright light appeared on the summit of the mountain. It rapidly increased, and presently a vast stream of incandescent lava came flowing down the side, now moving in a broad sheet, now rushing down in a cataract of fire, again to unite at the foot of a precipice, as it rushed down in a dozen different streams, some close to where the boats lay, till reaching the water, they suddenly disappeared. "Very fortunate that we were not on shore, or we should have been all burned into cinders," said Tom. "We are even now nearer than is altogether pleasant. If we get further off, we shall be in the middle of a cross sea, which will quickly swamp us," observed Green. "I see the crests of the waves dancing about, not many cable lengths away, with the light from the mountain reflected on them. We shall pull back a short distance to the eastward and lie on our oars." The boats' heads were turned round, but the men had not pulled many strokes when the lava again rushed out from the crater, rising far above it in a fountain of fire. Then down it came, covering over the whole side of the mountain with a vast sheet of liquid flame, sending its glare far over the ocean, and rendering the night as bright as the day. "Grand!" exclaimed Billy Blue Blazes. "Magnificent! Superior to anything I ever saw at Vauxhall." "I should rather call it awful," said Tom. "How those huge black cliffs stand out! Why, they positively look as if they're about to topple down over us. It will give us an idea of what the world will be like when it is on fire." The men gazed at the burning mountain, their countenances expressing their feelings, though none of them spoke. The hardy seamen could scarcely believe that they should escape destruction. The water hissed and bubbled as the hot lava reached it, and sent wave after wave towards the boats, which, as they rushed on board, were found to be perceptibly warmed. Green, who had been watching the summit of the mountain, began to doubt whether it was prudent to remain in the neighborhood. At any moment it might send up not only lava, but ashes and stone and huge rocks, which might in an instant overwhelm the boats. Now came a fearful rumbling noise, louder than 1,000 Woolwich infants roaring together. Tom declared that the whole mountain seemed to shake, while the summit appeared covered with a crown of ruddy flame. "This will never do," cried Green. "Better be swamped at sea than be buried under a shower of rocks. Pull round and give way, my lads. Stand by to hoist the sail the instant we feel the wind." The men dashed their oars into the water and pulled away as fast as they could stretch their arms, eager to get to a distance from the fearful scene. But though they were really going at a rapid pace, it seemed as if the mountain was still as near as ever. Even the most dull and ignorant must have been conscious of their utter helplessness. At any moment the fiery shower might descend on their heads. Indeed, the farther they got off, the more clearly they saw the fearful work going forward on the summit of the mountain. The flames seemed to spout higher and higher and higher, and amid them every now and then appeared huge fragments of solid rock which, cast up to a great height, again fell down into the crater, while similar fragments came toppling over the edge and rolled crashing down the cliffs into the ocean. Though the sea was rough, the wind, affected apparently by the outburst of fire, seemed greatly to have abated, and it was not till they had got some distance from the island that Green ordered the sails to be hoisted. He was on the point of hauling up, intending to beat back to Santa Cruz, when once more the gale was upon them. "We must stand on," he cried to Tom. "We shall never be able to pull back against this wind. Our best chance is to run before it." "Aye, aye, sir," said Tom. I'll follow you." And the two boats flew on as before, over the tumbling seas. They were well built and well managed, too, or they would to a certainty have been swamped. They had by this time got to a considerable distance from the mountain, but still it appeared almost as clear as at first, the dark cliffs projecting far out from amid the sheets of fire which almost enveloped its sides, while the summit appeared in a still more fearful state of eruption than at first. Vast flames came sprouting upwards, and the fiery masses which were thrown out spreading over every side, while overhead appeared a dark canopy of smoke, from which a shower of ashes continued to fall without intermission. And Tom declared, as he looked astern, that he saw huge pieces of rock descending into the sea. They had indeed reason to congratulate themselves that they had not delayed longer under the mountain, and even as it was, they were conscious that they were still not free from danger. Their anxiety had hitherto prevented them from feeling hungry, or indeed from recollecting that they had brought only a small supply of food. In each boat was, however, a breaker of water, and Billy had slipped some biscuits into his pocket, as had also several of the men, just before they shoved off. After some time, when he believed that he had only the danger of the ocean with which to contend, Billy pulled a biscuit out of his pocket and offered part to Tom, who, beginning to feel very hungry, accepted it. The crew were sharing their portions among each other, and then the breaker of water was broached, for the biscuit had made the men feel very thirsty. In Green's boat the men were not so well off, Archie and one of the men only having had sufficient forethought to bring a couple of biscuits apiece. This afforded but a scanty meal to all hands, and they knew that it might be very long before they could hope to get a further supply of food. The gale had still further increased, and the sea was rougher than ever. They thus ran for some hours. Tom manfully sat at the helm, assisted by Billy, his anxiety keeping him broad awake, for he well knew that the slightest carelessness on his part might lead to his own destruction, and that of all with him. Unhappily, they had come away without a compass in either boat, and as the sky was completely overcast, Green had not even the stars to steer by. The wind, he felt sure, had shifted several points while they lay under the island, and he was thus uncertain at what direction he was running. He could only tell by looking astern at the mountain, which, like a huge beacon, blazed away all night. There were other islands, he knew, ahead, surrounded by reefs, and when morning approached, he judged that they would not be very far from the nearest. The atmosphere, however, was too dense to enable him to see the land at any distance. Still, he could not venture to heave to. His only hope of keeping the boats afloat was to run on, and he trusted that daylight would return before they would reach the neighborhood of the reefs. It was too dark to see the hands of his watch, even when held up so that the light from the mountain could fall on it. "I think the sun will rise in about half an hour," he observed to Archie, "and then I trust that we shall be able to look for an opening in the reefs, so that we may run in and take shelter till the gale is over." The men in both the boats were all this time employed in bailing, for the crest of the seas came toppling over, now on the quarter, now running up alongside over the gunwales, wetting the people through and through. Tom, with his lips closely pressed together, his hand firmly grasping the helm, excited the admiration of the men, who knew well that their lives depended on his coolness and judgment. "He's a regular chip off the old block, as like the commander as 2 peas," observed the bowman to the man sitting next to him. Tom, indeed, had always been held in respect by the crew, but that night's work raised him still higher in their estimation. They had been running on for some minutes when a shout reached them from the master's boat. "Breakers ahead and land beyond them." Tom steered straight on, waiting to see what Green would do, still following in his wake. Green deviated slightly to port. "There's an opening," he shouted. "Follow me." Tom peered through the mass of blackness surrounding them, and made out a line of white foam, rising like a wall on the starboard bow, while beyond he could just distinguish the outline of a still darker mass, which he knew must be land. His heart did not sink, nor did his hand tremble. The crew turned their heads over their shoulders as the roar of the breakers reached their ears, becoming louder and louder as the boat rushed on. The seas came rushing up astern more furiously, it seemed, than ever, catching them now on the port quarter. Should the wind fail them, or rope give way, they must be lost. They all knew that, and each man grasped his oar, ready to throw it out and give way as a chance for life. The breakers became more and more distinct, leaping high above the tumbling ocean. But ahead was a blacker patch, though even that was streaked with foam. There must, however, be depth for the boats to pass over, though the passage was a fearfully narrow one, for away on the port bow the breakers were seen rising as high as on the starboard side. Green stood on. He did not again hail, but he knew that he could trust Tom, and that he was following. In another minute they would be safe, or the boats dashed to pieces on the coral reef. Still on they flew. A vast surge came rolling up, lifting the stern of the boat, and Tom for an instant thought that she would broach to. But with all his might putting the helm hard aport, she went rushing on before it. The foaming, roaring breakers were leaping up on either hand. He had lost sight of Green's boat. Could she have met with the fate that he had expected to overtake his boat? No, there she was, safe inside the reef, with all her sail lowered. The next instant he was gliding forward in comparatively smooth water. "Lower the sail," he shouted, "and get out the oars." He was soon alongside Green's boat. "We will lie on our oars and wait till daylight to find a safe place for landing," said the master. "Let us thank God that we have escaped thus far. Should there be natives on the island, we must try and keep on friendly terms with them, and we shall the better do that by not landing till they invite us. In the meantime, we will look to our arms, for they must have got wet and are pretty sure to miss fire." The boats accordingly pulled along the lagoon till they reached a part where, sheltered by a higher line of the reef, the water was perfectly calm. Even there, as they looked in the direction from whence they had come, they could see the burning mountain blazing away as furiously as at first, the upper portion, which appeared above the horizon, presenting the appearance of a vast shining cone, with a crown of fire rising toward the sky. Far off as it was, the light it cast had enabled them to see the breakers much sooner than they had otherwise would have done, and had been the means of thus saving their lives. End of section 33. Recording by LHardie, Calgary, Alberta. Section 34 of The Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by LHardie, Calgary, Alberta. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 24, Part 2. Daylight now appeared, and a glimpse was caught of the sun through an opening in the cloud just above the horizon. His rays fell on a hilly country, richly wooded with streams flowing down at the bottom of the valleys, one of which emptied itself directly opposite the break in the reef by which they had entered. As yet no natives had appeared, nor were any huts seen, but it could scarcely be supposed that so fine a region was destitute of inhabitants. Green, therefore, pointed out to his men the importance of acting cautiously. Their hunger and thirst, however, must be satisfied. He therefore pulled in toward the mouth of the stream, where, at all events, they could obtain water. As they approached, Billy's sharp eyes detected some coconuts growing on several tall trees a short distance from the beach. These could afford them food until more substantial fare could be obtained. The difficulty, however, was to reach the trees where the fruit grew. "I'll manage to do it," cried Billy, "in a way I have read of somewhere, with a rope round my waist." Some rocks near the mouth of the stream afforded sufficient shelter to the boats, and enabled the party to land without the necessity of beaching them. The arms had all been made ready for use, and Green ordered one half of the men to remain in the boats under Tom's command, while he led the other, who carried the breakers to fill with water. Billy, in the meantime, with Archie to assist him, prepared to climb up a coconut tree. He had brought a long piece of rope which he formed into a large grummet, or hoop, round the tree. He made several attempts, however, before he could succeed in getting up even a few feet. Though Archie laughed at him, he was undaunted. "Practice makes perfect," he answered, again working his way upward till he got several feet higher. His plan was to hold tight with his knees while he jerked the grummet as high as it would go, and then to swarm up again and rest. Higher and higher he got, till at length he was able to catch hold of a branch by which he held himself up, when, highly delighted, he quickly broke off all the fruit on the tree and threw them down to Archie. His success encouraged the bowman in Green's boat, who, being a light, active lad, succeeded even better than he had done, and a supply of nuts for all was thus obtained. By this time Green's party with the breakers had returned, and the hungry crews eagerly commenced breakfast. "We must look for more substantial fare than this, though," observed Tom. "If we can't get any animals on shore, we shall, at all events, be able to find shellfish in the water, and we can easily light a fire and cook them." Till, however, the men had satisfied their hunger with the coconuts, no one felt disposed to hunt for shellfish or for animals on shore. It was, indeed, doubtful whether it would be prudent to allow any of the men to go inland till they had ascertained what inhabitants were in the neighborhood, or whether they were likely to be friendly. From the character of the natives on the surrounding islands, Green very much doubted whether this would be the case, and he wished, if possible, to avoid bloodshed. Even though his party might prove victorious, he had also heard that they used poisoned arrows, even a slight wound from which might prove fatal. As the gale still continued blowing outside, it was absolutely necessary that more substantial food should be found. As soon, therefore, as they had somewhat taken the edge off their appetites, he allowed a small party under Tom to proceed along the beach in search of shellfish, while the boats pulled slowly along close into the shore, so as to be able to take them off immediately should any natives appear. No officer could have acted more wisely and cautiously. Tom and his party collected a good supply of shellfish, his last find being a bed of oysters. Two of the men, having stripped off their clothes, waded up to their necks and dived for them. They were thus employed when Green caught sight of a dark triangular fin, which rose for an instant to the surface and disappeared. He shouted at the top of his voice to the men, telling them of their danger, and ordering his own crew to pull in and to splash the water as much as possible with their oars. The men sprang towards the shore, fully aware of the danger they were in. They were not a moment too soon, for the monster, having caught sight of their white legs, dashed forward and almost grounded itself on the beach before giving a whisk of its tail. It darted off again, startled by their shouts and cries, and escaped. Tom now cried out that he had seen some birds, and that if he might use some small shot, he was certain that he could kill several. Green, seeing no sign of natives, thought there would be no risk, and gave him leave. Tom was a good shot, and the birds, a species of pigeons, being unaccustomed to firearms, were not frightened, so that he very quickly made a heavy bag, without having to go far for it. There appeared to be now no reason why the party should not land to cook their provisions, and, finding a clear stretch of beach, they pulled in and hauled up the boats. Some of the men set to work to gather sticks, and a blazing fire was soon lighted, while others plucked the pigeons and prepared them for the spit. These were placed on forked sticks around the fire, while the men sat down on the ground to enjoy themselves. A few cried out for grog, but not a drop of spirits had been brought, so they were obliged to go without it. But the smokers had their pipes and tobacco, and Green had put his cigar case into his pocket, so that they were able to pass the time pleasantly enough while the birds were cooking. "After all, we've no great cause to complain," observed Tom, as he lighted one of Green's cigars. "I suppose when the gale abates, the ship will come look for us, or if not, we shall have no great difficulty in getting back to Santa Cruz, while in the meantime we may make ourselves happy where we are," he observed. Billy Blue Blazes, of course, echoed the sentiment, but Archie was somewhat doubtful whether they might not miss the ship, as it would take them the best part of 2 days to pull back, and before that time she probably would have come out to look for them. Green was rather inclined to be of Archie's opinion, and was considering what, under the circumstances, it was best to do. "Dinner ready, sir," said Jerry Bird, who had dished up the pigeons with some large leaves. "We have broiled oysters and mussels, and coconut for dessert, and as much milk and water as we like to drink. A feast fit for a king." Green and the midshipmen preferred the pigeons, leaving the shellfish to be divided among the men, who had their share also of the birds. No one had cause to complain of want of sufficient food. After dinner, their spirits being raised, they amused themselves by playing rounders, varied by a game of leap-frog on the beach, till Green reminded them that they might have a couple of nights or more at sea before they could get back to the ship, and that it was as well to take some rest while they could obtain it. The difficulty was to find shade, as the sun was beating down with intense heat on the sand, though while they were in exercise they did not think of it. The palm trees afforded but scant shelter. However, by going a little way inland, they obtained some enormous fern leaves, with which they quickly built several huts, sufficient to shelter all the party, with the exception of 2, who were stationed on the top of the bank to keep watch, Green deeming it prudent not to run any risk of being caught napping. It fell to the lot of Archie and Tim Nolan, who belonged to Green's boat, to keep the first watch. Green directed them to remain in the shade under the trees with their muskets in their hands, and to keep a bright lookout inland, so as to be able to rouse the party in good time should any natives appear. There was an opening in the valley just where the party were encamped, extending 1/8 of a mile or so inland, leaving the trees on either side some distance apart. Archie took one side and directed Tim to get into the shade of the other, so that they might thus, without having to step far out into the sun, command the whole of the open ground. Archie felt very tired and sleepy, and was longing for his watch to be over, but, none the less, obedient to orders, he kept a bright lookout, seeing also that Tim did the same. They had been on the watch for nearly 2 hours when Archie, as he stepped out a few paces from where he had been standing, caught sight of 3 or 4 black figures at the farther end of the glade. They stopped as they saw him, regarding him with looks of astonishment, each man seizing an arrow and fixing it in his bow. Archie shouted to Tim and told him to waken the sleepers, while he himself entered into the center of the glade, and while he held up his musket in one hand to show the blacks that he was armed, made signs with the other to them to keep back. Green had heard his voice, and was on his feet in an instant, calling out to the rest of the party to show themselves. The blacks, seeing that the strangers were much superior to them in numbers, did not advance. They were savage-looking fellows, with their hair tied up in a huge bunch at the backs of their heads, and destitute of any clothing with the exception of a short kilt of matting tied round their waists. They appeared rather surprised than alarmed, and after watching the strangers, apparently to see what they would do for some minutes, they darted off among the trees, and were hid from sight. "We will get the boats into the water and be ready to shove off, in case those fellows should come down in overwhelming numbers, for though we may keep them at bay, I am anxious to avoid bloodshed," said Green. Tom agreed with him, and the men immediately began to launch the boats. But the tide had fallen, and it was no easy matter, as they had to shove them over the rough beach for some distance. While they were thus engaged, loud shrieks and shouts reached their ears, proceeding out of the forest, and in another minute a whole host of the blacks, armed with bows and arrows, spears and clubs, poured into the open, and came rushing down towards them. It seemed scarcely possible to get the boats afloat before the savages would be upon them. Green waited till the last moment, then, calling the men, drew them up on the beach and ordered them to present their muskets, but not to fire until he should give the word. The blacks, who were apparently well acquainted with the power of firearms, on seeing the force opposed to them, not only halted, but drew back several paces, bending their bows, however, as if they were about to shoot. Green, on seeing this, made signs to them to retire, pointing at the same time to his men's muskets to let the savages understand that they only waited his command to fire. The blacks evidently understood him, for they at once relaxed their bowstrings, turning their heads over their shoulders as if about to beat a retreat. Just then, however, a chief made his appearance and began to harangue them, urging them, it seemed, to attack the strangers who had ventured to land on their shore. The moment was a critical one. Green saw that he might be compelled to order his men to fire, and should the savages have sufficient courage to rush out and attack them before they had time to reload, they must be clubbed or speared. He knew, too, that the blacks' arrows were poisoned, and that every person wounded by them would die. He would gladly have retreated to the boats and made another effort to get them afloat, but should he show any sign of fear, it would to a certainty encourage the blacks to come on. "Stand ready, my lads," he cried. "I'll try once more to make the savages understand that we don't wish to quarrel with them." And taking up a bough which formed part of one of the huts, he waved it slowly backwards and forwards. The effect at first appeared to be satisfactory, but just then the voice of the old chief who had before incited them to attack the strangers was again heard, and the savages, encouraged by him, once more drew their bows, while he, flourishing his club, came forward at their head, leaping and bounding in the strangest fashion, his followers imitating his example. "Tim Nolan," shouted Green, "as soon as I give the word, pick that fellow off. If Tim misses to you, Bird, give an account of him. Don't throw a shot away, my lads, and we'll make them repent interfering with us." Green wisely said nothing about the deadly effect of the poisoned arrows, hoping that the men would not think about them. Just as Green was about to sing out "Fire," feeling that it was useless any longer to entertain hopes of maintaining peace with the savages, a strange-looking being leaped out from their midst, armed only with a club, which, placing himself in front of the chief, he whirled round and round in his face, shouting at the same time at the top of his voice. He was a white man, though scarcely better clothed than the blacks, his body being tattooed all over with strange devices, while his long carroty hair hung down over his shoulders. No one attempted to interfere with him. Even the chief came to a standstill, while he bounded backwards and forwards in front of the hordes of savages, shouting and gesticulating in the most vehement manner conceivable. Having thus succeeded in stopping the advance of the blacks, he turned round and rushed forward towards where Green was standing. "Arr, sure, Master Green, it's myself, Paddy Casey, is delighted to see ye. So little was I after thinking, when I last set eyes on ye, that the next time you'd see me I'd be turned into a wild savage," he exclaimed. "What? Pat Casey, my man," cried Green. "Of course, I remember you right well, though I confess I shouldn't have expected to see you, one of the smartest hands on board the Tudor, in your present style of dress." Pat, looking at himself, gave a broad Irish grin. "Sure enough, your honour, and bad luck to them who left me here, thinking I'd be killed and cooked and eaten, about which I'll live to be telling your honour, when there's more time than at present. I've just been informing these black friends of mine that they were fools to come and attack you, seeing that you belong to a mighty big ship, which would come and blow their island right out into the sea in a quarter less than no time. And now I've got them to be peaceable. It would be as well to take advantage of the opportunity to get the boats afloat, for by my faith they're not the most dependable of people, and in another moment they may again change their minds." "I am much obliged to you, old shipmate," answered Green, "and if you can manage to keep the blacks quiet, we will have the boats in the water in a few minutes. Tell them we were driven by the storm on their island, that we wish to be good friends with them, as with all the people in these parts, and, provided they behave well to us, we will do them no harm." Sure, your honor. I'll tell them all that, and just anything else that may come into my head at the same time. And I'll answer for it that they'll be decently behaved as long as you stay, said Pat. Just keep them in play, then, while we get the boats afloat, and make them understand that we go away because it is our good pleasure, and not because we are afraid of them, said Green. Sure, your honor, I'll do that, answered the Irishman, with one of his inimitable grins, which possibly had been the means of enabling him to preserve his life. While he went back to his black friends, the two crews, uniting their strength, got first one boat afloat and then the other. Green felt greatly relieved, for, whatever turn events might take, he and his party would be able to get away without having to fight for their lives. Casey now returned. "The savages say, sir, that if you like to stop and be friends, they'll be friends with you. But I'm after thinking that the sooner you can get away from this, the better, for they're not altogether trustworthy gentlemen. Not long ago a sandalwood trader put in here and set her boat ashore, when they knocked every mother's son of the crew on the head, and ate them afterwards. To be sure, the Englishmen hadn't behaved altogether properly, for once before, when they had been here, they employed the natives to cut a cargo of sandalwood for them, and when they had got it on board, they refused to pay what they had promised, saying that they would come back again, and that it would then be time enough to talk about payment. When they saw you, they thought that you were people of the same sort, and so were going to treat you as they had done the others." "I must confess," said Green, "that the Englishmen met their deserts. But how did you manage to escape, my man? And what brought you to the island?" Your honor, that's a long story. And about the escaping, it was a narrow squeak I had for it. You see, when I was paid off from the Tudor at Portsmouth, I went up to London, when I entered on board an emigrant ship bound out to Sydney. While I was on shore one day and had been taking my grog pretty freely, a chap I had never set eyes on before hailed me as an old chum, and telling me he was now skipper of a fine schooner, asked me if I would join her, and promised that I should fill my pockets with gold in a few months. As they were just turned clean inside out, and I had my spree on shore, without any more ado I closed with them, and before I knew where I was going, I found myself stowed away on board the schooner, which at daybreak next morning sailed out of Sydney harbour. The craft, I discovered, was engaged in the sandalwood trade, cruising among the islands and getting it as best she could, sometimes in one way and sometimes in another, and very curious ways they were. We made several trips, and each time we came back with a full cargo. At some places we got the natives to cut the wood and bring it off, paying them with beads and trinkets when they were content with such things. At others with rum, muskets and powder and shot. When no natives appeared, we went on shore ourselves to cut the wood. At last the skipper took a new dodge, for he was in no ways particular. Having put into a harbour where the natives were friendly, he enticed above 3 dozen off, making them large promises if they would cut the wood for him, and undertaking to bring them home again as soon as they had done the job. All seemed very fair and above board. We had once sailed for one of the islands to the westward, which is inhabited by blacks of a terribly fierce character, but where plenty of sandalwood grows. Having landed our passengers, we went on shore, well armed to keep the natives at bay, while they were employed in cutting the wood. They worked well, and we quickly got a full cargo. Now, as the wind was from the eastward, and it would have taken us a fortnight or more to beat back to the island from which we had brought our labourers. While it was fair for Sydney, the skipper had no fancy to lose so much time. What he did do, therefore, but send the poor fellows back again, telling them they must remain and cut another cargo while he went to Sydney, and that he would come back and take them off. Knowing the character of the natives, they did not like this at all, and begged hard to be taken on board, saying that they would go on to Sydney, or anywhere else, rather than remain. In truth, it was a terribly cruel thing the skipper was doing, and I and another man told him so, and declared that when we got to Sydney we would make the matter known. He replied that we had better not, but said nothing more. The long and the short of it is that the poor brown men were left behind, and it's my belief that one and all of them were killed and eaten before many days were over by the cannibal blacks. The night after we sailed, it came on to a hard blow, and the next morning when I came on deck to keep my watch, I was told that Ned Mole, the man I spoke of, had been washed overboard. I had my thoughts about it, and couldn't help saying that I was sure there had been foul play. I'd better have held my tongue. In a few hours it fell dead calm, just as we were off this here island. The skipper, observing that he thought there would be some sandalwood on it, had one of the boats lowered, telling me to come in her. I, of course, went, without thinking that any harm was intended me. As no natives were seen, we at once landed, when the skipper ordered me to accompany him with an axe, saying that we would have a look for sandalwood. We had come some distance when at length we discovered some tree of the sort we were in search of. "Now, Casey," says the skipper, "do you cut as much as you think the boat's crew can carry, and I'll go back and fetch them up. I should like to have a sample of this wood, as it seems somewhat different to what we've got on board." "Aye, aye, sir," I answered, and, taking off my jacket and tucking up my sleeves, I began chopping away. I thought the skipper was a long time in coming back, for I had cut even more than he was likely to want. I waited and waited, but still saw nothing of my shipmates. At last I began to have some uncomfortable feelings about the matter. Shouldering my axe, I made my way down to the beach. I need not tell you, sir, how I felt when I could nowhere find the boat, and saw the schooner standing away to the southward, for the breeze had again sprung up. I shouted and shrieked, but she was too far off for those on board either to see me or hear me, and I felt sure that the skipper had left me behind on purpose, and had probably told his crew that I had been knocked on the head by the savages, or had met with some other fate. I was dancing about, shouting out, and tearing my hair with rage at being so treated, when, turning around, I saw standing close to me a dozen black fellows. They were all staring at me, wondering what I was about. I was too full of rage to feel frightened, and so, forgetting that they couldn't understand me, I began to tell them how I had been treated. They jabbered away in return, and I shouted louder and louder, thinking to make them understand what had happened, while holding my axe in my hand, which I flourished in the air. I leaped backwards and forwards as if I was a madman. In truth, I felt very like one. At last, one of the blacks, who seemed to be a chief by the big rings he wore in his nose and ears, and the long feathers stuck in the top of his head, came forward, waving a green bough, and then, putting out his hand, took mine, which he rubbed on his flat nose. It was a sign that he wished to be friends, and by that time, as I began to get a little cool, I saw that it would be wise to make the best of a bad matter. So I took his hand and rubbed it on my nose, and behaved to all the party in the same manner. From that time, the blacks treated me with great respect. Whether they had seen any other white men before that, I cannot tell. But at all events they saw that I was superior to themselves, and maybe they took me for a prophet or a great medicine man, or something of that sort. The chief had fixed his eyes on my axe, but I gave him to understand that I would not part with that. However, wishing to please him, I took off my jacket, and made him put it on, which pleased him amazingly, and bound him to me as a friend. It is my belief, from what I saw of them afterwards, that if they had found me sitting down and bemoaning my hard fate, they would have knocked me on the head and cooked me before the day was over. So I had reason to think myself in luck. The natives, I found, lived on the other side of the island, and for some reason or other which I could never make out, seldom came over to this side. They at once took me with them, and when we got to their village, which consists of a number of small huts not much bigger than beehives, the chief introduced me to his wives, who made me sit down on the ground, and brought me out some food. which I was very glad to get, seeing I was pretty hungry by this time. In return, having nothing else to offer the chief lady, I took off my shirt and put it on her, which pleased her as much as my jacket had her husband. It was not pleasant to go without clothing, though I still held on to my trousers, but it was better than being killed, and I thought if I could make the chief and his wife my friends, I might be able to live pretty pleasantly among the people. I succeeded even better than I had expected, and from that day became a sort of prime minister to the chief and general of his army. I found, however, that another of his wives was jealous of the first, who had got the shirt, so, thinking to please her, I made myself this here petticoat, and presented her with my trousers, and she didn't fancy putting them on the right way. She threw them over her shoulders, and wears them in that fashion to this day. "Well, Pat, you have indeed a narrow escape of your life," observed Green. "Do you wish to live on with your friends?" "No, your honour. 'Tisn't for a decent man like me to desire altogether to turn into a savage," said Pat. "I'm mighty eager to get back to the old country to see once more my brothers and sisters and the rest of the Casey family, so if you will take me with you, and supply me with a pair of trousers and a shirt, I'm ready to go off at once, though I shouldn't like to appear on board without some decent covering to my skin." "I shall be very glad to take you," said Green. "But will the chief be willing to part with his prime minister? I'm afraid the whole country will go to rack and ruin if you leave him." "I'm afraid, your honour, that I must leave the country to look after itself," answered Pat, with one of the broadest of his grins. "And as to axing the chief about the matter, I'm after thinking it will be better to take French leave, lest he may try to stroke me. The weather, I see, is moderating, and if your honour will take my advice, you'll shove off as soon as it is calm enough to put to sea." "We can't go without food, and it will take us some time to collect enough to last till we find the ship," said Green. "Then I'll tell my friends that they must bring us some, for not a rap of salary have I had since I became Prime Minister, and if they were to load the boats up to the thwarts, I wouldn't be overpaid for the good I have done the state," said Fat. And, flourishing his axe in the fashion he had found so effective, he made his way back to where the blacks were now seated on the ground, discussing apparently some important matter or other. The chief listened to him for some time, and he and his people, then getting up, disappeared among the trees in the distance. "I've done it, your honour," said Pat, who quickly returned. "They'll soon be back with as much as we require for some days to come." While the savages were away, a fire was lighted, and the remainder of the shellfish and the birds which Tom had shot were cooked. The boats were also got ready, so that they might put to sea as soon as the provisions arrived, or, in case the natives after all should prove treacherous, shove off at a moment's notice. Green knew well the danger of an encounter with savages armed with poisoned arrows. A shower of such arrows might wound every one of the party, and he was aware that even slight hurts might prove fatal. At length the blacks made their appearance, carrying baskets containing taro, coconut, several other roots and fruits, and some fish of various sizes. By Pat's direction they were placed on the ground, when Green, not wishing to take them without payment, collected some handkerchiefs and clasp knives, and a few other articles, which he desired Pat to convey to the chief. This unexpected gift afforded intense satisfaction to the savages, who would have rushed forward and rubbed noses with the strangers, had not Pat hinted to his friends that such a proceeding would not be appreciated by the white men. The blacks, having set down their baskets, retired, and they were forthwith conveyed to the boats. While the natives were absent, Tom had wisely refilled the breakers. "Now's your time, your honour," cried Casey, who feared that his friends might suspect his intention of leaving them. The men, by Green's direction, retired quietly to the boats, Pat trying to keep himself concealed among them, and while they were embarking, he also jumped in and stowed himself away in the stern sheets of Green's boat. "Shove off, your honour," he shouted out, "or they'll be coming down to stop me." Before the boats had got half a cable's length from the shore, the chief discovered that his prime minister had disappeared, and suspecting that he had gone off with the white men, he and his tribe came rushing down to the beach shouting vociferously for him to come back. "That is more than I intend doing," cried Pat from the bottom of the boat. The surf had by this time considerably gone down, and the sea was sufficiently smooth to enable the boats to steer a direct course for Santa Cruz. Green could, therefore, only hope that the ship might not have left the harbor to look for them, as, in that case, they would in all probability miss each other. End of section 34. Recording by LHardie, Calgary, Alberta.
Section 35 of The Three Commanders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brent Nasworthy. The Three Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 25. Jack's anxiety became very great when, after the boats had gone away in chase of the schooner, he saw the threatening state of the weather. He waited for some time, expecting them to return, and then ordered the steam to be got up, intending to go in search of them. The gale, however, increasing and night coming on, he had but slight hopes of success. At length, the engineer reported that the steam was up, and in spite of the risk he ran, he stood out of the harbor, steering in the direction he supposed they had taken. Scarcely had he got outside than the weather became worse than ever. All night long the ship continued standing backwards and forwards over the ground where he expected to find the boats, while, as they happened at the time to be under the lee of the burning mountain, he of course could not see them. At daylight he steamed back into the harbor, hoping against hope that they might have returned. But his fear was that though the natives had behaved well in the presence of a big ship, they might conduct themselves very differently should a couple of boats only take shelter in their harbor. His doubt, therefore, was whether he should remain to wait for their arrival or go in search of them. He did not, on his return, bring up, but, after remaining for a short time under way, he again put to sea and stood to the southward. A bright lookout was kept for the boats, as also for the schooner they had chased, for it was thought possible that, finding bad weather coming on, they might have remained on board. The island where they actually were at the time was sighted, but no signal being made from it, he stood on. He then visited several islands farther to the south, on which he thought it possible they might have landed. Towards evening, the Dragon came off a small island, the character of the scenery being similar to that of those in the neighborhood. As she approached the coast, a vessel was sighted on shore with her masts gone, and it was very evident that she was a complete wreck. "Should any of the people have escaped, we must do our best to help them," observed Jack to Mildmay, as they stood looking at the wreck through their glasses. "I am afraid there is very little chance of that," answered Mildmay. "But if they should have reached the shore alive, the natives are nearly sure to have clubbed them." "We shall soon ascertain the state of the case," said Jack. "In all probability she was cast away during the gale last night, and we may still be in time to rescue any who have remained on board." The Dragon stood on with the lead going, as close as it was prudent to venture, when her head was put round and a boat was sent away under charge of Mr. Large, who was directed to board the wreck if he could, but on no account to venture on shore should any considerable number of natives make their appearance. The boat pulled away, first making for the wreck. The boatswain's proceedings were watched from the deck with great interest. He first visited the wreck, and after he had been some time on board, he was seen with the assistance of his men, lowering a person into the boat. He then pulled for the shore, but just as he reached the beach, a number of savages rushed out from among the trees and sent a flight of arrows at their visitors. He immediately pulled away and came back at a rapid rate to the ship. "2 of the men are hit, sir, I'm afraid," he said as he came on deck. "And an arrow has gone through the arm of the poor fellow we took out of the wreck, who was before almost dead of hunger and wounds. There seems now but little life in him of any sort. All I can make out about the vessel is that she is the expert, of Sydney, and from the look of her hold, I should think that she had a number of slaves on board, though what has become of them is more than I can tell." No time was lost by the surgeon in looking after the wounded men. His great aim was to neutralize the effects of the poison. The man taken from the wreck, notwithstanding Mr. Large's report, recovered considerably, and was able, in a faint voice, to answer the questions put to him. He said he was the mate of the vessel, that she had wrecked the previous night, when the master and several of the hands had been washed overboard, that the passengers had broken loose and made their way to the shore, where, however, they had been attacked by the natives, who, to the best of his belief, had killed or captured every one of them. "Then what became of the rest of the crew?" asked Jack. The mate said he thought it possible that they had got away in the boat with the doctor and second mate during the night when there happened to be a lull, but of this he was uncertain. He confessed that the vessel had been boarded by 2 man-of-war's boats, but the officer in command, finding nothing to detain her, had allowed the schooner to proceed, while they, he concluded, had returned from whence they came. Mr. Large, who was present at the examination of the mate, thought it just possible that the boat might have left the wreck, and if so, that she was in all probability driven on shore, when those in her must have shared the fate of the so-called passengers. Mr. Large, however, volunteered to go on shore to try and ascertain what had really become of the people. The ship was, by this time, about half a mile from the beach, so that through a glass everything going forward on shore could be seen. Soon after the boat had shoved off, a considerable body of natives issued from among the trees and stood gazing at her and at the ship. They were all armed with clubs and spears and bows and arrows, but, as they did not by their gestures show any hostile intentions, the boat continued her course, the boatswain still hoping, apparently, to establish friendly relations with them. As there was little or no surf, the boat ran onto the beach. Mr. Large stepped on shore, waving a white flag in his hand, and holding out several articles which he had carried with him as presents. On seeing this, 2 of the natives, placing their weapons on the ground, advanced towards him, when he gave each of them a present and signed to others to come forward and receive the remainder. As he was all the time covered by the muskets of the men in the boat, he did not appear to consider that he was in any danger. As soon as the natives had received their presents, they retreated to a little distance and sat down, he imitating their example. He then, by signs, endeavored to make them understand that he wished to know what had become of the people who had landed from the vessel on the rocks. They seemed to understand him, and replied by signs that the people had gone away into the interior. He, on this, tried to make them understand that he wished them to be brought back. They made no reply, but talked eagerly among themselves, and he could not tell whether they intended to comply with his demands. Still, they appeared to be as friendly as at first. He was still sitting on the ground waiting for their answer, when their party was increased by several other persons, who advanced from the larger body in the background. They were all young men, who, though they had laid aside their bows and spears, still retained their clubs. Having seated themselves, they made signs that they also wanted presents. When they found that they were not forthcoming, they got up, and approaching the boatswain, who had also risen to his feet, one of them tried to snatch his cap, while another seized a cutlass which he had buckled round his waist. On this, with a blow of his fist, he knocked the savage down, and was in the act of drawing his weapon to defend himself when another black, who had sprung up behind him, dealt him a blow on the head with a club, which felled him to the ground. So rapidly had this taken place that the boat's crew were not prepared to fire till they saw him fall. They instantly poured in a volley, which killed 2 of the savages, while the rest bounded off towards their companions. The seamen, then reloading, sprang on shore, in the hopes of bringing off the boatswain, whom they supposed to be killed. All that had occurred was seen from the ship, and Jack immediately ordered 2 shells to be thrown in the direction of the savages, which, falling into their midst just at the moment that they were drawing their arrows to shoot at the seamen, drove them back into the forest. The arrows thus flew wide of their mark, and the seamen were able to convey Mr. Large to the boat, and to shove off without molestation. Several other shells were fired in the direction taken by the natives, who immediately scampered off, leaving several dead behind them. On the return of the boat alongside, Mr. Large was seen sitting up, when, with some assistance, he managed to get on deck, notwithstanding an ugly gash he had received at the back of his head. "I'll never trust those black rascals again," he exclaimed. "They very nearly did for me, just as I thought I was getting on so well with them. I only hope our boats won't have landed on their shores, or they'll receive an unpleasant welcome." "I trust not, Mr. Large," said Jack, who, on having such evidence of the savage disposition of the natives, was becoming more and more anxious about Green and the midshipmen. "However, you did your best, and now you must let the surgeon look after you, for that wound in your head is an ugly one." The boat was, after this, again dispatched, to bring off any arms or articles of value which could be found on board the schooner, and then, as she was a perfect wreck, she was set on fire to prevent the savages from benefiting by her loss. This done, the ship proceeded along the coast, when a little farther on she opened a village, which there was every probability belonged to their late treacherous assailants. A couple of rockets fired into it quickly set it in flames, and another village in the neighborhood was treated in the same manner. Jack considered that this punishment was necessary to teach the natives that they could not attack white men with impunity. Jack was, by this time, almost in despair of recovering the boats, but would not yet abandon the attempt to find them. If they had escaped foundering or being driven on a reef, they must have reached the shores of one of the neighboring islands. He resolved, therefore, to go back to Santa Cruz, and then to steam round every island in succession, narrowly examining their shores. The ship accordingly stood back to Santa Cruz, though Jack scarcely expected to find the boats in the harbor. A lookout was kept on every side, and at night blue lights were burned frequently to attract their attention should they be in the neighborhood. In the morning watch, just before daybreak, as the ship was gliding smoothly on with a light breeze, a hail was heard on the weather bow. It was so faint that had the screw been going at the time, it would not have been noticed. Mr. Mildmay, who was the officer of the watch, ordered the yards to be braced up, and kept the ship in the direction from whence the hail came. Again it was heard, louder. "There's no doubt about it," he exclaimed. "That must come from the boats. Call the commander." In a minute Jack was on deck. At length the 2 boats could be seen under sail, running down towards the ship. She was immediately hove to, and in another minute they were alongside. Instead of the woebegone, half-starved beings Jack expected to see, he was delighted to find them all in good condition and excellent spirits. Green and Tom gave a rapid account of their adventures. After leaving the island, they had gone to Santa Cruz, where, not liking the manners of the natives, after obtaining a fresh supply of water, they immediately put to sea again in search of the dragon, which Green felt pretty sure would not be far off. No one was at all the worse for the adventure, and Green's old shipmate, Pat Casey, from being able to speak the language of the natives, proved of great assistance during the remainder of the cruise. He, to be sure, did not always make himself understood, but that might have been because the natives spoke a different dialect to the one he had acquired. Numberless atrocities were brought to light, some committed by the sandalwood trader and kidnappers, who were generally the aggressors, but others by the natives, who had treacherously cut off several boats' crews and murdered numerous individuals, who had been surprised, much as was Mr. Large. Where the crime could be brought home to the natives, they were punished by the destruction of their villages in canoes. In 1 or 2 instances in which the chiefs had been implicated, they were carried off and left on other islands at a distance, from whence they were not likely to be able to return. It was a far more difficult matter to get the white men convicted and punished for the foul deeds of which they had been guilty in these regions. At length the dragon's course was shaped for Sydney, where Jack had the satisfaction of finding the Aeolus, which had arrived a short time before him. Adair had numerous adventures to recount, very similar to those which the dragon had met with. The chief satisfaction they experienced on their arrival was to receive letters from home. Their wives were bearing their separation as well as could be expected, and gave them very minute accounts of all their doings. Julia was living at Halliburton, and Lucy had been paying a long visit to the Admiral and Mrs. Deborah, both of whom were somewhat ailing. The Admiral could rarely do more than take a few turns on the esplanade, sitting down between each on one of the benches facing the sea to watch the vessels as they ran in and out of the harbor. The officers of the two ships were received with much hospitality by the inhabitants of Sydney. They were made honorary members of a club equal to any in London, and balls, dinner parties, and picnics were got up for their entertainment. Indeed, after their long absence from civilized life, they very naturally thought Sydney a magnificent city, as indeed it is, rising as it does gradually from its superb harbor, and thus exhibiting to advantage its fine public buildings and substantial residences. In the suburbs were seen a number of beautiful villas, many of considerable size, while cabs, omnibuses, and other public conveyances, and handsome private equipages abounded. Indeed, carriages were kept by families who would not have dreamed of maintaining them at home. Not a few of the officers made up their minds to return and settle in the country. The midshipmen, for a wonder, did not lose their hearts, possibly on account of the small encouragement they received from the young ladies, who literally and metaphorically looked down upon them, being, as a rule, much taller than they were, and well able to distinguish between the various ranks in the service. Indeed, some little disappointment was felt when it was discovered that the two commanders were married men. The ships, having filled up their coal bunks, shaped a course for the Sandwich Islands. As it was important to husband their coal, the greater portion of the passage was performed under sail. Numerous islands were seen, several of them being regular coral islands, with lagoons in the center, not more than a couple of miles in circumference, and some even much smaller, and rising within a few feet out of the water. About 6 weeks after leaving Sydney, Oahu, in which Honolulu, the capital of the Sandwich Islands, is situated, was sighted. The ships ran on and came to an anchor in the outer roads opposite the city, which is very conspicuous from the sea and has a somewhat imposing appearance, with its numerous public and private edifices spread out along the shore, and churches and tall spires in their midst. The coast had a barren appearance, very unlike the beautiful region everyone had expected to find it. Far behind the town, the land rising into high ridges, divided by deep and narrow ravines, amid which but little vegetation was visible, while the surf in a succession of long rollers broke along the reefs on each side of the inner anchorage, threatening any vessel with destruction which might have parted from her anchors. The next day, a portion of each ship's company got leave to go on shore. Tom, Desmond, and Archie were once more together. As they pulled in, they were highly delighted at seeing a party of the natives sporting in the surf on their surfboards. Now they swam out through the breakers, amid which it seemed impossible any human being could exist. Then, mounting to the summit of a huge roller, one of them would leap up on his board in a standing posture and glide down the side of the watery hill, balancing himself in a wonderful manner. Another would perform the same passage while sitting, or a third would throw himself full length along his board. In the same manner they would return to the shore, fearlessly approaching the surf, through which they made their way to the beach. Some 20 or 30 young men and lads were thus sporting together. On landing, the midshipmen were assailed by the owners of horses, much in the same way that people landing in European cities are by porters or drivers of vehicles. The Kanakas, as the natives are called, were habited in every variety of costume, some fully clothed, others with little more than pieces of native cloth round their waists, though the women were all decently, if not elegantly clad in long calico gowns, reaching from the shoulders down to the feet, generally of gay colors. Both men and women appeared good-natured and ready to laugh and joke with their visitors. There was no quarreling about the horses. The midshipmen were soon suited with steeds, on which they hoped to enjoy a pleasant ride. their party was increased by Green, who had taken charge of another set of youngsters. All being mounted, away they galloped across the plain at the back of the town. They had not gone far when they overtook a cavalcade of fair damsels, seated on men's saddles, with long skirts fastened round their waists, and their heads adorned with wreaths of flowers. They answered the midshipmen's salutations with shouts of laughter, and either supposing that they had had an invitation to do so, or, which is not improbable, not thinking it necessary, they joined company. And away midshipmen and maidens galloped with a speed which would have tried less hardy steeds. Before long they overtook other parties of girls. On they went till a hill was reached, over which they scampered, descending at breakneck speed, into a plain of still larger dimensions on the other side. Here the road compelled them to keep closer together, as it passed between several sugar plantations. Tom had fixed upon a pretty Kanaka as his companion, who could speak a few words of English, as was the case with many of the others. Indeed, most of the young ladies, though not very rigid in their manners, were fairly educated and remarkably intelligent. Away they went for several miles, till one of the elder damsels, looking at the sun, declared that it was time to go back again. And wheeling round their steeds, they returned as fast as they had come. On nearing the town, they made signs to the young officers to fall into the rear, while they advanced at a more sedate pace, when they scattered in various directions to their different homes. This was only one of their many excursions on shore. Honolulu is a capital city, though a small one. Few cities of its size contain more churches and schools, but, unhappily, they are not all of one denomination. For Protestants, Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics have of late years entered the field with the Presbyterians or Independents, by whose means the natives were converted to Christianity. It now boasted of a cathedral and an English bishop, who, while the ships were there, headed a grand procession, with banners and bands playing, terminated by a display of fireworks and healths drunk in champagne opposite the king's palace. But whether it was of a religious or merely social character, our midshipmen's friends were unable to determine. A considerable amount of trade is carried on, the chief export being sugar to the United States. There are merchants and inhabitants of all nations, but by far the greater number are Americans, who hold also some of the chief offices of state. There was a theater, in which not only plays but operas were performed, and there were various other places of amusement. It was indeed difficult to believe that comparatively a few years ago the country was sunk in heathen darkness, especially when it was reported that few kingdoms are better governed, and no people taken as a whole more orderly and contented. Happily for itself, having no harbors of sufficient size to afford shelter to men of war, or which are capable of being defended, it is likely to remain as heretofore independent, unless republican principles should prevail, and the people involuntarily join themselves to the United States. The then king was said to be an amiable and enlightened gentleman, as well educated as most of the European sovereigns were but a few years ago, and the young dowager Queen Emma, who has English blood in her veins, was pretty, sweet-tempered, sensible, and altogether a most excellent and attractive person. Still, notwithstanding the attention the officers received from the inhabitants, they agreed that Honolulu was not a place at which they would wish to remain for any length of time. "Hurrah!" cried Tom, rushing into the berth one afternoon. "We are to be off tomorrow morning for Hawaii, and if there's time, some of us will have a chance of visiting the volcano of Kilauea, and the very spot where Captain Cook was killed. The commander told me I might tell you, and I advise you fellows who haven't got your clean linen off to send for it without delay, or you may chance to have to wait for it till our return, which I hope may be never." Several of Tom's messmates jumped up on hearing this to follow his advice, as the Kanaka washerwomen were not likely to prove more honest than those of other places, or to return washclothes before the time agreed on. The next morning the two ships were steaming out of the roads. For a few hours they brought up in the far-famed bay of Kealakeku, on the north side of which was a rock, protected from the swell by a point of lava rocks, thus affording a convenient landing place. Near it, at the foot of a coconut tree, is the spot where the celebrated navigator breathed his last, and on the still remaining stump of the tree was nailed a sheet of copper, on which was inscribed an account of the event. Most of the officers having visited the spot and inspected its surroundings with such copies of Cook's voyages in their hands as were to be found on board, the ships steamed out again for Hilo Bay, on the other side of the island. Round the shores appeared groves of tall coconut and richly tinted breadfruit trees, with extensive plantations of sugarcane beyond, while amid them flowed numberless murmuring streams. Above this lower level rose a succession of pasture lands, surmounted by belts of trees, changing their character from the vegetation of the tropics to that of the more northern regions of the world. The country indeed sloped upwards 20 miles or more, forming the side of an elevated tableland in the center of the island, out of which sprang towards the sky 2 mountains of prodigious height, that of Mauna Loa the nearest, in the form of a smooth dome, and Mauna Kea, surmounted by 9 snow-covered cones. Above the tableland appeared a silvery cloud, showing the whereabouts of the fearful crater of Kilauea, which it was the intention of the 2 commanders to visit on the following morning. As night closed in, its position was rendered still more visible by the glare of the ever-burning fires within the crater reflected on the cloud. At early dawn, Jack and Adair, with a party of their ship's companies and as many of the officers as could be spared, and who wished to go, started for the shore. Jack took Tom and Archie and Mr. Mildmay, who undertook to narrate the events of the expedition in verse. The second lieutenant declared that he had no wish to toil up a steep mountain for the sake of seeing a huge pit full of fire and smoke, so that he willingly remained on board instead of the first lieutenant. Several others, however, had more curiosity. Adair took Desmond and 3 or 4 of his gunroom officers and midshipmen. "Now recollect that none of you must run the risk of being turned into cinders by tumbling into the crater," observed Jack as they were setting off. "I rather think that gas would be the product of such an immersion," observed the doctor. "There wouldn't be so much solid matter of you left in 5 seconds as I could put into my snuff-box, so look out for yourselves." Horses and guides were in readiness, for of late years the once mysterious residence of the goddess Pele has become one of the lions of the world. "Forward!" cried the commander, and the party trotted on, headed by their guide. 8 miles on they passed a vast chasm, after which they began to ascend more rapidly than before. In a short time they entered a region of black lava with hollows in it full of water, into which the natives on foot plunged to cool themselves. Trees, however, were still seen, which had sprung up amid the once burning mass, and bushes of various sorts, among them strawberries. Not here low plants, but vines of large size bearing delicious fruit. Just below the edge of the plateau was a forest, and on rising above it, the vast dome of Mauna Loa of a bronze hue rose before them, against the deep blue of a tropical sky. They barely had time to reach the edge of the crater and to pitch their tents, which had been sent on before, when the sun set, and the surrounding darkness revealed 2 lakes of liquid fire down in the depths of a vast basin, with perpendicular sides several miles in circumference, and an apparently level bottom. For some time they gazed at the scene. Not a word was uttered. Even the midshipmen failed to cut a joke. No loud sounds were heard, no reports, as many of the party had expected. But instead there came up from the bottom of the abyss a low, bubbling murmur, like that emitted by a thick liquid when boiling, for to nothing else could it be likened. Guided by some of the natives, Jack and Terence, with the 3 midshipmen, climbed down to the ledge some 100 feet below the plateau, when they found themselves apparently not much above the margin of the largest of the 2 lakes of fire. "There are a good many things I would dare to do, but I shouldn't like to jump into that," said Tom, as he watched the mighty volume of lava in a furious state of ebullition, forming fiery waves which ran ceaselessly across the lake, towards a wide abyss to the southward. Sometimes the whole seemed rising, and suddenly, at the distance of scarcely 300 yards, a vast column spouted up to the height of 60 or 70 feet, almost as quickly subsiding, and the next instant another rose still nearer to them, which made even Jack spring back, for so near did it appear that he could not help fancying that it might fall upon them. After watching this wonderful phenomenon for some time, the rest of the party were very glad when Terence proposed that they should climb up from whence they came, an operation which took them the best part of an hour. The early part of the night was spent before they could manage to go to sleep, and even then few of them could get the terrific scene they had witnessed out of their heads. They had not been long asleep when all hands were aroused by a report like thunder, which came up from the vast lake boiling beneath them. Everybody started up. Billy Blue Blazes, seizing hold of Desmond, alongside whom he was sleeping, exclaimed, "Is the volcano going to burst out and smother us? Won't it be better to run for it?" "Hurrah! Sure it will be running faster than we can," answered Desmond, who wasn't quite comfortable, though he didn't wish to show it. On looking over the cliff, however, the lake was seen boiling away as before, sending up here and there spouts of fire, which, at the distance they were below them, looked like flashes from firearms at night, though probably 50 or 60 feet in height. No one, however, felt inclined to turn in again for some time, in spite of the cool air which circled around them. As they looked over the crater, the shadows from its mighty walls were cast upwards, reaching, it seemed, to the sky, and giving it the appearance of being clothed in a dark cloud. "It is very fine," cried Terence at length, "but if we wish to enjoy our ramble tomorrow, we shall be wise to get a little more sleep." His advice was followed. After breakfast next morning, several of the party started off to walk round the crater, while the more adventurous ones, including the two commanders, Tom and Desmond, with a couple of Kanaka guides, again descended another part of the cliff to the ledge. On looking at the spot where they had stood on the previous evening, a thrilling sensation came over them, as they observed that it had disappeared in the burning lava below, the cause undoubtedly of the noise which had startled them during the night. Still, they were anxious to get close down to the boiling lava, and obtain some of it in a state of fusion. Their guide confessed that many had gone and come back safe, but that he considered it an expedition of no slight danger. Probably at that moment neither Jack nor Terence were thinking of their wives at home. They had gone some way, when suddenly the whole mass surged upwards, and the lava on which they were walking began to crack, while terrific reports were heard. "Back! Back!" cried the guide. They needed no second warning, but, keeping apart, made for the upper ledge. All had gained it, except Tom, who, being at a distance from the rest, made for a part which, when he got up to it, he found inaccessible. Close behind him at that moment, the crust was rent asunder by a terrific heave, and a vast jet of molten lava, with a fearful noise, rose high into the air. Almost roasted by the heat, he cried out for help. In another moment it would have been too late, when the guide, hearing his voice amid the uproar, leant over and, just able to grasp his arm, though his own face was burnt in the attempt, jerked him up with a strength few of Tom's companions could have exerted, and placed him in comparative safety. Not a moment was to be lost, for the seething mass was fast gaining on them. Up the cliffs they climbed, till they gained a place of safety. "We've had enough of the inside of the crater," said Jack, as he thought how nearly Tom had been lost, and they made their way again to the upper rim of the vast basin. The larger lake, they calculated, was 1,190 yards long, and about 700 wide. The smaller, nearly circular, and upwards of 300 yards across. The lava continued rising till it overflowed a large portion of the hitherto black surface, in some places appearing like a vast sheet of liquid fire, in others running along in serpentine courses. As their time was short, as soon as the party who had gone round the crater arrived, the tents were packed up, and they commenced their descent by the way they had come. The next day the ships weighed, and shaped their course for Vancouver's Island under sail. Jack and Terence were eager to reach their destination, in the hopes of finding letters awaiting them there from England. In about little more than 3 weeks they entered Fuca Straits, up which they ran for about 60 miles, with magnificent scenery on both sides, though desolate in the extreme, till they reached Esquimalt Harbor in Vancouver's Island, about 3 miles from which stands Victoria, the capital. Jack and Terence eagerly awaited the letter bag, which, as soon as their arrival was known, would be sent off to them. Jack was reading his letters when Adair came on board. "Jack," he said, "the kind old Admiral and Mrs. Deborah have both gone, and have left Lucy and me the whole of their property." "Our good old friend's dead!" exclaimed Jack in a tone of grief. "I can scarcely realize the fact. I can remember him from my earliest days, always the same, kind and wise, and hearty and full of spirits. I saw a great change in him before we left, but still hoped to be greeted by his cheery voice on our return. How my father and mother will miss him. I especially must ever hold his memory in grateful remembrance," said Adair with feeling. "For Lucy's sake, I am most thankful that he and his kind sister have left us their property, as indeed I am for my own. I must be off for England as soon as I can get superseded, as it is absolutely necessary to settle their affairs. I wish you had as good an excuse as I have." "I heartily congratulate you, Terence," said Jack, "but I am not sure that I shall not also have to go home before long. For Julia writes me word that her father is very ill, and much wishes to see me. As we have already served 2 years, I don't think that the Admiralty will object to supersede us, as it will give them an opportunity of obliging some of their friends." After the 2 young commanders had somewhat got over the sorrow they naturally felt at hearing of the Admiral's death, their spirits recovered, and when together they could talk of little else than their proposed return. They hoped to be sent down to Panama, where their ships could wait till their successors arrived. They possibly, on this account, took less interest in Vancouver's Island than they might otherwise have done. Though present at a naval regatta at Esquimalt, when the quiet harbor assumed a wonderfully gay appearance by the arrival of numerous steamers and boats of various descriptions from Victoria, and also at several cricket matches played between the settlers and the officers of the ship's companies, and at a ball at Government House, the midshipmen voted the ball a decided failure, as far as they were concerned, in consequence of the small amount of attention they received from the fairer portion of the guests, though they considered the cricket matches and regatta very good fun. At length, the Dragon and Aeolus were ordered to Panama. Soon after their arrival, 2 officers, who had come across the isthmus by railway, made their appearance on board with the welcome information that they were to supersede them. They were both old shipmates, in whom they could place thorough confidence. They therefore left those who had so long sailed with them with less regret than would have been the case had they confided them to the charge of strangers. Notwithstanding the distance they had to pull, their respective midshipmen begged leave to man the boats which conveyed them on shore. And a few minutes after landing they were seated in the railway car, which rattled on through the rich vegetation of the tropics, across the famed isthmus to Cologne, the port on its eastern side. Thence, proceeding by the mail steamer, they safely reached Southampton, where Julia and Lucy were waiting to receive them. The important affairs which had brought them home took some time to settle, and, Colonel Gifford soon afterwards dying, Jack found himself in possession of a comfortable income, which few people were better able to enjoy. He frequently heard from Tom, who liked his new commander, and gave an amusing account of the subsequent adventures he met with in the Pacific. That young gentleman never alluded to the fair Feodorovna, and in a letter Jack received from Higson, he learned that she had married, not long after her sister, a Russian gentleman of good fortune, though she never failed to inquire after her youthful admirer, hoping that in 10 years or so he would find an English wife to suit him. Dick Needham got charge of a ship in ordinary, and nothing gave him so much delight as to receive a visit from his old shipmates, who never failed to go and see him when they went to Portsmouth. Ben Snatchblock remained in charge of the Stella, and every summer when Murray was at home she was to be seen trim and taut at her old moorings off Barcaldine. The 3 commanders paid their wives the compliment not to apply in a hurry for employment, though they all at different times had commands offered them, which, however unwilling they were to leave home, they felt it their duty to accept. They were in due time posted, and all 3 are now admirals. End of section 35. End of The 3 Commanders by William Henry Giles Kingston.